Alright guys, let's go ahead and get started. Today I wanted to talk about sort of what I think is going to be like sort of my perfect TTRPG system, if that makes sense. I wanted to, obviously, I feel like if you are in the sort of hobby and you kind of play TTRPGs for a while, whether that's D&D or Pathfinder, Cyberpunk or Traveler or Call of Cthulhu or whatever, at some point you kind of brush up against the system and you're like, well, there are things that maybe I don't love about the system, or maybe it doesn't really doesn't represent exactly what I kind of want out of the game. It doesn't really help fulfill my fantasy sometimes super well. And so I think that's sort of one of the things that kind of drives people like me and maybe people like you when we're playing with these, and then we start kind of branching out and feeling and playing some different systems and different genres and understanding how they deal with their sort of resolution mechanics, how they represent sort of proficiencies, how they represent the power scaling of a character and the threats and the level of magic or technology or whatever it is in the world. And as you do that, you start to sort of create, okay, if I could, grab a little bit of this spice, and a little bit of this spice, a little bit of this spice, a little bit of this spice from each different game that I've played, and sort of make a spice blend, what would that look like as sort of mine, yours, whoever's sort of perfect tabletop RPG system? Because I'm going to guess that even if you've only been playing D&D 5e/2024 for maybe, I think you can do it even within probably a year of playing the game, if you're playing regularly, and be like, there are things about the system that I don't gel with super great, or things that I wish were tweaked or a little bit different. And I think as you step outside and you play more different systems, and you're like, oh, these are cool ideas that are nowhere in the game that I usually play with my group. So what might that look like? What can I learn from that? And this is sort of where we get, of course, we get things like homebrew rules and things like that. But I wanted to take a sort of broader scope, so I've been sort of like in the last week, I just kind of jotted down some ideas of what I thought my perfect TTRPG system might look like. And I think that that's a useful exercise for myself and for you to try to figure out what existing systems already do the best job of sort of exemplifying the games that I want to play, and what systems would I want to, or what changes would I want to make to certain systems to help better facilitate that fantasy that I'm trying to encapture in my games, whether I'm running them or playing them. So I grabbed this, went to take a little look at it. I tried to write down a few different things I've liked from a lot of different systems over the years that I've played, and sort of things that gripes I either have with D&D or with other systems that I think, mesh together can make a what feels like the system that's tailor-made specifically for me. So I thought we'd go through it. Maybe it'll be a nice exercise. Maybe you can do it along with me if you want, and try to think about it. And hopefully this will inspire you to go out and try to look at it, and then think, okay, if this is what I want, do I try to homebrew a system that already exists, or maybe this is, the kickoff point where I'm like, well, I've been doing some homebrew rules, I've been doing some, classes or things like that, and maybe I'm ready to dip my toes into doing a little bit more full-scale TTRPG design for maybe my own system. So why don't we go ahead and hop in? That's all the preamble. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If this is your first time here, hey, thanks for checking out the channel. Subscribe, do all that good stuff. Share it on social media, all that algorithm engagement, etc. It's all good. So yeah, let's go ahead and hop in. Let's take a ride. So I pulled it up. I've got a sheet up for us to just, and I'm just going to kind of translate these notes so you can see me, so I can sort of process them in real time while we're kind of talking about them. So, and these are so I just listed a bunch of things. They're in no particular order, but I figured we would go ahead and do that. So the first one, my sort of first one, the top banner item is a simple core mechanic with the juice. So what do I mean by the juice? The juice, I feel like, is that thing that it does that really makes that core mechanic kind of stand out. So if I was going to say D&D 5e 2024, I would say that would probably be the advantage disadvantage mechanic. So you have the core d20 roll that you do a d20 test. That's ability checks, that's saving throws, that's attack rolls, etc. And right, you get the advantage mechanic or the disadvantage mechanic, which is a very easy way that allows you to roll more dice, and rolling more dice is usually more fun. Within limitations, there's a big asterisk at the end of that statement. And so it's a lot more fun, and it doesn't have some of the fiddly floating modifiers or something that, you know, a D20 D&D legacy that comes out of something like 3rd edition, where there's a whole bunch of like little floating modifiers, a lot of +1s, +2s, +3s, -1s, -2s, -3s that you kind of have to stack together sometimes when you're making a check, which is a little complicated. So that is one thing that I really like about 5e, though it is not actually the one that I chose. But let me go ahead and write it down so we can go ahead and get this one in the books. So I'm just gonna go ahead and capitalize that. So a core mechanic with the juice. So if you've only played D&D in 5e in 2024, you might be putting the advantage disadvantage mechanic with the unified sort of d20 roll mechanic. I would say this is one of the things where it's really helpful to have gone out and played a lot of different systems, because my choice for this is actually not that, even though I love that system, you know, play it every week, really enjoy it, but I wanted to shine a light on a different sort of core mechanic system that I really like, that doesn't get talked about really at all, which is unfortunate, because a new game in the series, video game in the series, just came out, to maybe middling response, but it does have a nice legacy to it, and that is the age system. Which is a 3d6 with stunts. And I'll just say 3d6 with stunts. So the age system first came out as after Dragon Age Origins, so it was actually a licensed TTRPG game that came out that was a Dragon Age pen and paper role-playing game based off the Dragon Age setting. I played it. It's fun. I really like the core mechanic. The downside of the Dragon Age setting is if you roll your minds all the way back to Dragon Age Origins, or if you've never played it, there's not a lot of enemy types, and that was really a hindrance for the system. Because at some point you're like, well, I'm tired of fighting Darkspawn, and this game is like 99% Darkspawn. And that's most of the creature. There's not a very large bestiary for the game. But that was a Dragon Age license. But the system itself, the Age system, the AGE system, was good enough that they spun it off and they've used it for a lot of other things. And I really like sort of the Fantasy Age system, which is sort of the Dragon Age system with the serial number kind of filed off on it. So it's got that sort of Fantasy Age base, but it has much better bestiary. It's got a much wider sort of genre and theme than specifically the Dragon Age Origins video game. So it branched out a little bit, and that really helped the system. Now, unfortunately, it's published by Green Ronin. Unfortunately, it's just not... It's hard to get people off of D&D. We know this. We know it's really difficult to get people to try out a different system from D&D. So it's always been sort of a off to the side, more of a novelty than anything else. But I can tell you a little bit about the 3d6 mechanics and why I like them and why I like that juice. So one of the things that's really big and different about it is you're rolling 3d6 instead of a d20, which means that it now has that sort of more normalized distribution curve, which means that the bonuses that you get from things like expertise and tools are a little bit more important to your general success rating. It improves your general rate of success instead of something like a d20 where you have a 5% chance of rolling a 1 or rolling a 20. Most of the time in the 3d6 system, you're going to roll about, let's see, what is 11? 10 to 11? I think it's 10.5. 10.5 is sort of the average, the mean sort of roll there. And it's not just that. So with the 3d6, when you choose your 3d6 to roll, you have two colors of one die type, and then you have a third d6 that's actually a different color, and this is the stunt die. And so you add them all up together, but anytime that you get doubles, you get a number of basically stunt points. And the number of stunt points you get is not the double, but is actually whatever's on that other colored die. So you might roll 2 2s, but if on the off-colored die you have a 6, you have 6 skill points, and you have to roll doubles to get into the stunt table. So basically, that's instead of critting, it's just every time that you roll doubles, you get to do cool extra stuff. And it's not, hey, I mean, there are options on it where you just like, I do a little bit more damage. But often it's like, I get to do a cool thing, or I get to do an extra attack, or I get to do a movement, or do some of those other sort of like an item interaction or something like that for free. And you can spend those points on the table, because I think the table goes 1 through 6. And so if I have 6 points, I can do the 6-1, but I can also do, I don't think you can double up. I think I can do like a 1, a 2, and a 3. And I could do all of those stunts together. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. It gives you this ability that when you reach doubles, it's just, you dig deep and you have a really cool turn that you jump out and do everything for. So it's a really cool system. If you haven't checked it out, I'd say go check it out. I think you can get the, I'm pretty sure you can get the sort of quick start from Green Runner for free. And I think there's a second edition of it out now, which I haven't played. So I can't say too much about that. But the first edition, I really enjoy. And there's different stunt tables, depending on what you're doing. So there's a stunt table for like weapon attacks, there's a stunt table for things like social situations or exploration, which I really enjoy. Having a mechanic that actually gives you a little bit of framework as to when you succeed or how all these cool extra things you can do in something that's other than just, I do double damage. Like something like a D&D crit where there's not really an associated sort of crit framework for something that's like an exploration check or a skill check or a saving throw or anything like that. We don't really deal with those sort of natural 20s on that side of that in something like 5e or 2024. Whereas in something like the age system, there is a very clear thing. And so there's tables for like weapon attacks, there's tables for magic and spell casting, and I don't remember, like I said, it's been a while because it's really hard to find people to play it with. Just because people don't know it, and it's hard to sell somebody on a generic fantasy RPG when they already have D&D in their back pocket sometimes. It's really hard to be like, I mean, I could play a different game that's going to kind of give me a D&D feel. So you have to get somebody sort of over that hump of saying no about that. Just be like, hey, can you just try it for a session? Let's just try it and see how you feel about it. So I don't remember... On the magic stunt table, it's sort of like similar to what things look like for meta magic for somebody in D&D, for sorcerers. When you're like, and I cast a spell, and now I do some crazy extra stuff with it. So that's what it looks like, but I can't remember. I think there is a GM complication stunt table, but I don't remember off the top of my head, where the GM gets to also do stunts. Like if you make a roll and you roll doubles, but you still don't pass the check sometimes, I think there's a GM complications table. If not, that is definitely something that I would want to add to it. And so I'll just add that within here. So I'm saying plus a GM complications table. Or maybe tables. So yeah, that's the sort of core mechanic that I really like. It's got that good juice where it's just like, if you roll doubles, suddenly your turn turns into sort of like a big deal. It's not the standard. And it's a really great way, I find, to really refresh and really shake up things that, especially you can fall into with something like D&D with the fighter, I hit it with my sword kind of feeling, where you're like, all right, I move up and I do 2 attacks, and you're wanting something that's a little bit more pizzazz, or something that's like, oh, I got a crit, and everybody's like, yeah, crits, but functionally you're like, I do like 7 more damage. So this gives you something that's like, when you go above and beyond, you do something, you have the opportunity to do something other than just, I do a little bit more damage with something, which is really cool. And there's a framework for GMs on how to sort of, through the stunt system, how to clear adjudication sort of lines. So it kind of fences in the field of possibility to be like, okay, this is roughly about the power of what you could expect you're going to get when you stunt here. When you crit here, based off of sort of your power level and the amount of stun points you have. It kind of gives you a very clear, as a GM, it gives you a very clear framework of what power something like the equivalent of a natural 20 feels like in the system, which is really cool. So yeah, that's number one, the core mechanic with the juice. That's the one I like. Alright, let's move on to sort of the next point that I've got noted down here. So we've got simplified combat order of operations. This is primarily about initiative. This is something I just do with D&D anyways. But let's see. I'm just going to say simplified combat operations. You know what? I'm just going to make these bullet points. That might make that a little bit easier. Let's do that. Let's... So this is going to be our second one here. Because now we're getting into sort of a combat-specific kind of things. So simplified combat. So one of the things that I do, and I know I've talked about it on the channel before, but I use a fast, slow round initiative. It's worked out really well for me, and I have another DM who's using it in a campaign that I'm in playing, and it works really well. So instead of, if you're coming from something like a standard D&D Pathfinder kind of background, you know initiative orders, especially modern, is like you roll at the beginning of combat, and that's your place in the round and every time. And in old school combats, obviously you roll each time, and if you keep going back, right now you're talking about sort of side initiative, which you also do each time. So this is a little bit kind of split in the middle between full side initiative and full individual initiative. So the fast and slow round is basically, and I'll put it on here, the monsters take 10 on initiative, where they just kind of have a general initiative rating. So, and it's usually whatever their initiative bonus is. And this is something that we're actually seeing in some of the 2024 updates that I've been using for a while, but it was nice to see it in the 2024 update. Is that there is an option now to just take 10 on initiative, the same way that they sort of do average damage. They've been doing average damage for monsters and things like that. So that's a really interesting thing to see that already going that way. And fast and slow round is something that kind of comes from a lot of skirmish war games. They're using a number of those, especially solo skirmish games, where the bad guys always kind of go in the middle, and then if you meet or beat their initiative, you get to go before them. And if you don't, you go in the slow round, you go after them. And usually in skirmish games, you roll each round. I haven't really been using it that way, just because that's a lot of extra bookkeeping to do really quick, especially when I want more of my D&D style individual TTRPG combats to kind of be snappy, and trying to do initiatives every round kind of slows down the game for not too much benefit. I feel like in my eyes, it's not too immersive for me, but that's a personal taste, obviously. So fast slow rounds, monsters take 10, and then it works like sort of side-based initiative, except without all the. So in old D&D, of course, you have a clear operation about like melee attacks, ranged attacks, movements, spell casting, about when each of those actions happens in a round. Where this is a lot more sort of like modern D&D. Let's say three of the four members of the party are going in the fast round. One side, they say, hey, you, and you, it's your turn. They get to strategize and tactically decide however they want to go in whatever order they want to go. So if that's the rogue that's like, oh, I'd rather go first and get sort of my little alpha strike thing done, and you're like, yep, go ahead, go do that. Or maybe you have the wizard who's like, actually, let me cast magic weapon on your daggers first and then do it. And so there's a little bit of coordination in between both the fast and slow round about how people want to go. And I like that because it keeps people more engaged instead of sort of what I see in a lot of D&D games, which is like, I have my turn and then I kind of sit back with my phone or whatever and don't kind of pay attention for the rest of the round until a monster hits me or it's my turn again. And so this kind of gives you a more collaborative space mechanically, kind of pushes you towards doing that. Being like, oh, well, I have a really good idea of what I want to do, so I'm going to go first, and that gives the other person time to be like, I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do on this turn. And so there's a little space for them to already start thinking about it because it's already their turn, but also they're not the one who's talking about what they're doing in that turn yet. I don't know if that quite makes sense. Basically, for the people who have a strong idea of what they want to do, they can just immediately go and do it. And the people who need a little bit more time, like your casters who kind of want to look through some spell options, they can sort of delay and be that third person who goes in the fast round. So there's two people's turns who can take turns while they flip through spells and try to figure out, maybe this is what I want to do, maybe this is what I want to do, or can be like, well, I'm looking for opportunities to enhance my fellow. So it's like, hey, before anybody does anything, I want to cast haste or something like that. It gives you that ability to do that and coordinate it together, which I really, really like. And it's, it's just simpler. Taking initiative doesn't take a long time. I just go, okay, the monsters go on 13. Who got 13 or better? You did, you did, you did. Okay, these three are going in here. And you got a 6. All right. I know that the cleric's in the slow round. And that's all I need to know. Everybody else goes in the fast round. And that initiative takes literal seconds for me to note down. I'm like, monsters, cleric at the bottom. Then I just know that everybody else is in the fast round. Super quick, super easy, not a lot of bookkeeping, not a lot of things that I need to keep track of, anything like that. So I really, really like that part. Another thing that's kind of in the simplified combat order of operations is something that really, it primarily comes from 4th edition, I think. And it's similar, it floats in a little space because in 5e D&D, 5e 2024 D&D, you have attacks and you have saving throws, and those are two ways to primarily damage creatures in combat. You either need to make an attack roll against them, or they need to make a saving throw against your DC. And so rather than having what is essentially the same mechanic flipped, right? Either I'm rolling to hit a target number because I'm attacking you, or you're rolling to hit my target number because you're doing a saving throw against something I'm doing. And I like this sort of 4E approach where it's just, everything's just an attack. It's your turn, you roll the dice. That's the sort of idea. So instead of having a saving throw, I go, okay, what's a good example of this? I'm just going to write down attacks only, no saves. What's a good example of this? Let's use a classic like Fireball example. So in Fireball in something like 5e or 2024, you go, okay, I cast Fireball. These 10, or the bad guy, let's say the bad guy. Let's say it's a dragon. The dragon breathes their classic fire breath. Very similar situation. Gonna hit everybody in the party. Okay, everybody in the party, please make a dexterity saving throw. And then you're trying to get 3 to 4 people to look up from their phones or their laptops or whatever they're doing because the way that sort of 5e 2024 modern D&D mechanics work is that you have your turn and then you just kind of bunk off until either it's your turn again or something attacks you and then somebody has to get a hold of you for a saving throw. Which instead, in sort of the 4e thing, it's like everybody has sort of static defenses. So your AC, instead of having a dexterity saving throw, you have if we were using 4e, you have a reflex, because it's kind of still built off of that 3rd edition idea of defenses or saves. So you have instead of having a reflex or dexterity saving throw, you just have what is the AC equivalent of that. So basically you take your bonus, you add the 10 to it, bada boom, bada bing. It's basically the same way how 5e 2024 deals with like spellcasting DCs or things like that. The same way that you figure out what your character's DC would be is the same way you would figure out a static defense for that character. So very similar. And I like it so that way when the dragon breathes breath, I'm like, okay, here's 4 d20s, 1, 2, 3, 4. We're gonna roll them. Okay, does 17 hit you? Does 19 hit you? Does 12 hit you? And does 10 hit you? And that's much easier than being like, okay, everybody, do your saving throws. Let me double check the DC. Okay, what did you get? Okay, you saved. You saved. You didn't save. You saved. Right. It's already, there's more back and forth instead of being like, this is the attack that happens. This is what happened to you. and I make the rolls and I just tell you the numbers. Did you pass? Yes or no? Those who passed take this damage. Those who failed take this damage. It's just maybe, and I mean, fully agree that it is a personal taste for sure. But there's something about having a clear mechanic that is it's this creature's turn and they are the one doing the action, but yet other people are rolling dice. Feels weird to me. Like there's this disconnect where saving throws for spells and effects are different than attack rolls. And it's just, I'd rather that be more unified. I think that's a very simple unification that could happen in the system and not lose a lot of the magic around the system. And it's still all the same things happen and be like, oh, well, actually my rogue has evasion, so they, even though they fail, they're going to take half that damage. Yeah, perfect, you take half damage, don't worry about it. We don't need to take that into consideration as you try to figure out what your bonuses to your saving throw is or anything of that, or if you have cover or things like that. Like, as the DM, I can auto-calculate all those things because I'm the one who's doing the attack. It's a slight tweak, but it is something that it wasn't until I feel like 4th edition, I stopped playing 4th edition and went back to playing things like Pathfinder, and then when 5th edition came out and playing different games that kind of go back to that tried and true saving throw mechanic, that I was like, actually, you know what? I'm not sure that I love this as much as sort of the other way where it's just whoever started this is always the one in charge of the action and the person who's rolling the dice. And I like that it's a little bit more cohesive to me, and I feel like it plays a little bit better at the table. That's that. Oh yeah. So let's we'll do some more here. So I'm gonna say this. So I want HP counts to be lower, which I think is a very common request or very common homebrew thing, especially for 5e 2024, is that the HP pools are really bloated. It makes combat really, really long. So let's say we want low HP counts. Let's go ahead and put that in there. So yeah, and primarily if you've played any sort of like OSR kind of game or played in older editions of D&D, pre-WotC editions of D&D, you're going to be very familiar with this, where you don't have a lot of hit points. And it's not necessarily for me the fragility of the character that's important. I mean, I do like that aspect of it, but for me it's mostly the amount of math. Less math with smaller numbers makes the game run faster. We already know that. And it's also, there's this idea of not being superhuman. When you look at something like 5e and you're like, oh, a commoner has, what, they have 4 or 5 hit points? Look at a commoner that has 5 hit points, and already a first level character might have upwards of triple that, 2 to 3 times that amount of HP. And it's hard to be like, well, then that person is already so divorced from what the average person is that it's hard to treat them as if they are a normal person within that world, when you stand them up next to other parts of the world and you're like, well, these two things are not the same or anything like each other. So I like that aspect of it, and I also like that it just makes the game run faster, specifically combats. We don't have, in OSR, you don't really have a ton of monster totals that are like in the 200s, 300s, etc., etc. Because it just kind of makes the game longer. And yeah, we represent, one of the big issues is we represent power, especially in contemporary D&D, as more damage. That more, damage per round. Everybody's very obsessed with that. Optimized power gamers are very obsessed with that sort of DPR output. And there are other ways to showcase power that's not just deal more damage. And you can just kind of squash that scale, so instead of being like, well, I do an extra 20 damage in an attack, well, if you did an extra 3 damage in this attack, when the hit point totals are so much lower, you can still keep that sort of equivalence where, oh, well, that still feels powerful compared to the total, even though it doesn't sound like much when we're dealing with single digit numbers saying it out loud. But it is the difference, and it's one of the things that really kind of annoys me about something like a JRPG, like a classic Final Fantasy JRPG where everybody's hit points go up to 1,000, go up to 999, but you also start the game in like with 100 plus hit points, and you're like, why don't we just divide everything by 10 and make the math a lot easier? Does it look less impressive? I guess, but it is functionally the same. And it feels weird to stop at 1,000, like 1,000 is the breaking point. I guess because now that's just the trope. That is what represents Final Fantasy or something like that at this point. Specifically JRPG, they really like that 999 max health, max damage kind of idea. But lower hit point counts can do the same thing, and it just brings the math in a little bit more and makes the math a little bit easier and makes the game run a little faster. So we're going to put down here is, easier math. Quickens the game. And shorter combats. That, quicken the game. So yeah, that's one of those things. So one of the things that I definitely feel like, and I know that a lot of other people feel like, is that D&D's combats are too long. And this is not a new problem. This has been going on for decades. Like, it's clearly a very much a design issue. Or a issue, and I think that they are doing what they're trying to do. It's just that I don't want the thing they're trying to do anymore, because I feel like that it's a lot of bloat. We run into this things where I've talked about this many times on the channel and on the blog and things, where really the sweet spot for any sort of D&D style combat feels like it should be about 3 rounds. And so if you look at what, if we're going to use that as the metric, the average DPR of what you can guess from a 4-person party, what that looks like, that gives you an idea of what a solo monster's hit point total should look like, assuming that they're hitting most of the time, more often than not. It gives you an idea of how many hit points they should have, and then you look at how many max hit points they actually have, and you go, oh, these are not very close. But then that's a whole discussion about sort of 5e and what will probably be 2024's monster math, which very much does not seem to have any sort of cohesion to it. That was always a sticking point back in as early as 2014, right when the DM, or I guess maybe 2015, right when the DMG came out, and we got sort of the information about like how to make your own monster, and then people tried to use that and went, well, a lot of the existing monsters don't fall within this framework. Like, not even like it's off by a couple numbers, like don't meet it really at all. And so it's hard to do that. So one of the easiest ways to sort of rectify that is sort of shorting the HP pool, for the most part. And I think that will help. That helps a lot. Lots more combats, quicker combats, make the combats a little bit more dangerous. I guess I should probably put that in there. More dangerous combats. And the reason I want more dangerous combats is because I want there to be a more conscious and intentional decision about when and where to apply violence to a situation, especially from the hero's player character's perspectives. Like, you could go in here and you could immediately try to fight this dragon, but this dragon might just kill you all. If you're assuming that you're playing in a world in which the power scale is not artificially matched to whatever your level is at any point, where it's like, well, a 3rd level party could run across an adult black dragon and have to deal with that. And if they decide to charge into combat, well, they're going to get smoked. So that's a very sort of 5e 2024, that sort of superhero fantasy that a lot of people talk about, well, it's really hard to because the game doesn't do a very good job of reflecting that the player characters still are fragile. So it's hard to get players to get into that headspace where they're not like, well, I have a ton of hit points, we have a ton of healing. It's really hard to kind of die in this system, assuming somebody is not actively trying to kill you when you're down, or your party isn't just abandoning you basically to make death saving throws for hell or high water. So instead, kind of putting that back together and being like, hey, you don't have a ton of hit points, and a couple bad hits, maybe that off chance crit is gonna, that might just take you out, and there might not be a way for, depending on how the magic system works, for the cleric to do the sort of pop up, pop down, where they heal you for whatever the minimum is. You get to take a turn, you get hit back down by the enemy. And I also want to talk about pop up, pop down too. I think that's in this list. If not, well, in case it's not, I'm just going to put it up here. I'm just going to pop up, avoidance. I'll just put it in there. We'll see if it comes up later or not. But yeah, that's one of the things that I want, that HP counts lower, and then that's very much an OSR thing, and it gives a different vibe to the game, a game that I really like, which is not a little less reskinned fantasy Avengers, a little bit more, okay, you're clearly better than the average person, right? You're more capable than the average person, that's why you're successful at doing this, but you're not invincible, both in the true definition of the word and sort of the show, is that you are still kind of a person. Oh, yeah, you like the ideas of no saves? Oh, and having spells be a roll cast like DCC. Yeah, I like DCC too. It's up here on my shelf. There's a lot of stuff I like about DC. It's got a very specific, old school kind of feel on it. My thoughts on spell slots, yay or nay? I'm not a huge fan of the Ancient casting. I wish, but for 5e in 2024, the spell point system, I also don't like. I've tried it out a few times, and I also don't like it. But I do prefer more of a mana pool, or a you have to successfully cast to get the spell off, or something like that. And more powerful spells are more difficult to pull off. I do like that idea that makes magic a little bit more, I guess, a little less accessible and a little less reliable. But unlike a spell slot system, having something like a mana pool gives you a little bit more flexibility. Or non-fantasy, yeah, like plenty of non-fantasy stuff. Play modern, play historical, play sci-fi, play cyberpunk. I'm kind of all over the place. I like a lot of different systems and different sort of genres within those systems. I guess this should just be a full combat section. I screwed this up. This should just be a full combat section, because clearly I was thinking about combat, which makes sense because combat's 2/3 of D&D. So let's just put combat notes here. And so we'll have a simplified combat system. We get our low HP counts. And the next thing we have in here, this could be a contentious one, depending on who you are. Armor is DR. Damage reduction instead of that. I think it kind of depends on your feelings on how much you like AC as a concept. Some people really like AC or don't see an issue with AC. I think AC is okay. I think it does the job. I still prefer armor as damage reduction because that makes more sense to me. And I think it makes, especially in a system where you can max out your dexterity and that also increases your armor class, it kind of devalues a lot of sort of heavy armor in a lot of ways. So having the armor be something that is effective regardless of how hard or easy you are to hit, something is something that I am very interested in, and I like systems to do it. It does slow combat down. That's really the only downside of it. Is that it does slow combat down, because then the person gets damaged and now they have to do a calculation. So I'm going to say a DR with minimum damage. So I do like systems that are also, if you hit, you successfully hit, the DR can never reduce the damage all the way down to just 0. You can't have, because I'm not sure that anything feels quite as bad as rolling for a successful attack and then being like, oh, but you did no damage because they had too much armor. And I'm like, ugh. Well, that really sucks. It's like, at least if there's minimum damage, even if it's 1 point of damage, it's at least chip damage. It's at least something, which is what I'm looking for. It's like, at least make me feel like when I succeeded, I at least did something. Not succeeded, but also still didn't do anything, which doesn't feel great as a player. Yeah, DR with the lower HP pools, it makes armor much more important. So, yeah, but I would still have minimum damage to be like, oh, well, I was going to deal 8 points of damage, you soaked up all 8 points of it, but you're still going to take at least 1 point of damage because you did get physically hit with this attack. You do take some damage from that. The armor doesn't absorb all of that impact just perfect. You're still a person within the armor, so you still take the concussive force of it, of being hit with whatever it is. Even if you, maybe it's not overt like slashing, you don't have a cut, or you didn't get stabbed, but you still had to weather that attack, if that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's important to me. Another thing that I put in here, because I'm not sure that's on this list, is that I want to open. So let me get. I know I have some things down here. Stackable armor. That's one of the things that I always toy with, which is there's a padding, a mail, or we'll use the American spelling, mail. Oh, or we'll say chainmail. To make it clear, chainmail. There's an armor, padding, and a sort of plate. So stackable armor, in which you have sort of like a gambeson or arming jacket underneath, then you can put a chainmail over it, and then you can do like a breastplate over that. And so kind of giving it 3 layers, so stackable armor. I would also have a system where you need to do some like repairs to armor. So I have a simple repairs. It'd be, really, it's not repairs, it's maintenance. Plus a simple maintenance framework. Full maintenance. We'll just say mechanic. Something that makes it, there's a reason for characters with a lot of armor to take a rest and have somebody who is able to make sort of like small maintenance style repairs to arms and armor. I like that. It gives people something to do in sort of not necessarily long downtime, but often I feel like when you have groups that take either a short rest or a long rest, and we don't really talk about what they do during that. This is a way to be like, oh, well, I'm actually going to do something that's actually going to help all of us. Let's decide I have this much time to work on something. Whose armor's in the baddest shape? I can take care of that. Do you need more arrows? Maybe we can fashion more arrows. Things like that. Kind of make that a little bit more present in the game. That there is, hey, you are going on an expedition, and you've got everything that you need to rely on basically on your person and on your back. And this kind of, I want to show a relation that this is why we have those things. Because I don't want things to be like 5e, where you look at the adventuring gear and they're like, hey, there's a whetstone you can buy. And it's like, great, I can buy this whetstone. It has no mechanical benefit to the game for me having a whetstone or not. It's just a flavor kind of item. Very similar, I feel like, especially 5e 2024 does that same thing with bedrolls and tents and things like that. There's usually not a lot of explicit mechanics that kind of tie in with just normal adventuring gear. Besides some of the obvious things like using rope, giving you advantage on athletics checks to climb things and stuff like that. I want more stuff like that, but for more gear. So it makes a little bit more sense as to why you carry around this stuff and what you guys kind of do in the in-between times when you're not explicitly delving the dungeon, you're not fighting monsters, and you're not sleeping. So kind of that middle area. I want a little bit more of clarity about what we think adventurers are doing and how and what they need to be doing at that to continue to be successful on their adventure. And then along with that is I would also make armor more available. And this, if you watch my cantrips video talking about all that stuff, and I do briefly just kind of touch on this, on the idea of one of my big gripes with something like mage armor is that it feels like it should be a class feature, a class ability, rather than a spell. Because if you're not going to give your casters like wizards, etc., access to armor, then you're kind of pushing them in a game that's mostly combat. And it's very obvious for anybody who's played a caster and not taken mage armor that having no hit points and 11 or 12 AC is a good way to get your character real dead real quick, or at least knocked out in most combats. And then you feel like you don't do a lot during those combats because you're spending one or more rounds unconscious making death saves or not taking your action because of it. So if that's the case where we're kind of pushing a narrative where the design's kind of pushing being like, you need to have mage armor, it's basically an automatic take for basically anybody, then let's just make it a class feature. And if we're not going to do that, then let's just give our casters the ability to wear mundane armor. So they can also do that and they can save their spells for, more useful things other than I have a thing that just represents armor class again. So just trying to get away from that, more available to classes. Sorry, I want to make the armor more available to and classes. Let's see, I'm gonna say PCs of all classes. And so that's a thing that that's I'm not sure that I picked that up from any specific system. Most of this, I mean, obviously DRs and damage reductions in a ton of games, and I do like that. As is minimum damage. Minimum damage shows up in a bunch of games, especially with DR. But I don't think I've seen a game that's got a lot of stackable armor on it, other than where are some games that I'm trying to think of? I think there are some things that are like more machine based, like starships in games where you have shields plus armor plus the HP pool of the ship, kind of work in a similar vein. Those are the ones that kind of jump off my mind. I don't see it represented a lot in the games. Multiple levels of armor that stack and work in concert with each other. And there are certainly games in which armor is not really a proficiency, so anybody can use armor too. Am I planning on making my own game combat-centric or more narrative-based? Ooh, that's a really good question. It's sort of like a primary conceit of the system that we're building. If I were building my own system, I would say neither. And I think people who watch the channel will clock me pretty quickly as being a very exploration heavy or exploration forward kind of player and dungeon master. I enjoy the dungeon delving and the overland travel and the exploring and trying to find hex crawling and finding your way through dungeons, getting lost in forests, trying to find the ancient temples and shrines and all that stuff. Like that's the juice for me. That's the part of tabletop role-playing games that I really like. Probably more than the combat or necessarily a full narrative structure where we have decided, okay, we are making a campaign about X, and so everything's related to X. I am very much more of I do enjoy a more emergent style play, where sure there's probably as a DM you want some sort of background, sort of main through line for your campaign to be like, hey, here's a big bad guy. He may not You might not decide that the entire campaign needs one big bad guy, like a very narrative focused campaign. You might, but you might be like, well, this is sort of the capstone BBEG for that whatever tier of play we're in, so that's going to bump up against them. But there's plenty of side quests and their own personal goals they're exploring. I do want that sort of some of those background elements where it's like, hey, as a character in the world, you have your own hopes and wants and dreams and flaws and all that stuff. That's not just like the blonde's ideals, flaws things, but it's like this is a thing that your character wants to accomplish. This is like a long-term goal for them, and then maybe one or two short-term goals that they're trying to accomplish in addition to the group's overall goals and what's going on in the world. Yeah, if you don't need more delving or explorations, you don't need as fleshed out rules. Yeah, and that is true. I think, but I think it's hard to get away from that if you want people to play the game, because they're going to want to get into combat. So I think you should have enough combat rules that it feels like a complete system, if that makes sense. And a lot of that exploration stuff, like I said, with taking care of the gear and doing that sort of stuff, that's marrying exploration and combat, trying to marry those tiers together, those pillars of play together, where how one impacts the other. Oh, we got really damaged in the combat, got to do a whole bunch of armor and gear repairs in the exploration thing. Now we're not making progress in the exploration phase because we decided to do the combat, or being in a situation, having that sort of situation, generally kind of what I'm looking at with sort of things like the low HP counts, being like, do we want to fight these people? If we can, is that going to be our go-to conflict resolution mechanic? Do we want to talk to them? Do we want to bribe them? Do we want to be in this fight? Do we think we can win this fight? Is there any point, would we even be willing to engage in anything that's not a lopsided fight in our favor? Otherwise, we should run away. And just kind of have a little bit more. I guess if I really wanted to boil it down to what I really want, is that I want more thoughtful play. Like, here's a situation, think about the situation, discuss, try to figure out, and pros and cons of however you decide to try to overcome a certain challenge. But still being open enough that you can kind of use whatever means you want. Now, can you talk to the giant stone golem and persuade them to get out of the way? No. I mean, they're a construct. They're mindless and they follow orders. So there are some constraints on that. But there are other things where maybe you can fast talk it or try to deceive it in some sort of way that you're the controller or you've been given access to an area. There are things you could do there rather than just a basic like, hey, could you not kill me and just not fulfill your prime directive? Because I think that's a little bit harder to maintain that sort of suspension of disbelief with. So the next thing we have up here, and of course if you guys have watched the solo game, we see this, I use this all the time. And this is tied somewhat to the stackable armor and the crafting and the maintenance and those sorts of things, and that is a resource die mechanic. So, if you've seen me play the solo RPG before, you know that we use a very simple resource die mechanic that goes 1d. I mean, you can go all the way up to 20. That's usually not the case, though. Because it just goes down. So 1d20 to 12 to 10 to 8 6 to 4 to 1. You could add in half steps for things like D3s or a D2. But in general, I don't do that. So basically the idea is, rather than doing a very finite way of tick boxes of tracking resources, things like ammunition, rations, materials, arrows, what have you. If you don't like being like, well, I'm going to check this little thing. I mean, you could even really abstract it out to something even like gold. I probably wouldn't do that, but you could abstract it to something like just gold. That falls a little bit more in line with something like how World of Darkness or Savage Worlds or a more skill system does when you take something like a trait or a feat. It's something that's like, this is the wealth. So this represents the sort of average access I have to money that I can spend on things, rather than actually tracking explicit dollars and cents. So it's a very simple mechanic. Whenever you use a resource, you roll the die. If you roll a 1, the die size shrinks. That's it. That's the whole mechanic. So, usually, I use this in the solo RPG. Usually, the way that we cap it is that you can carry up to a d6 of whatever it is on your person, on your back, just in your backpack. So you have a d6 of arrows. If you shoot more than one arrow, I have a conserving ammo. And this is actually from Gamma World. A conserving ammo, which is that if you only take one shot with your crossbow or whatever it is, then you are thought to be conserving ammunition, so you don't actually have to roll the resource die mechanic. You don't have to engage with the resource die mechanic at the end of the scene. But if you decide to shoot 2 or more times during the scene, so it's pretty much like if you're going to take out the bow and you're going to shoot more than one arrow, you might as well shoot as many arrows as you want, because you're only going to make the one check once we get to the end of the scene. So we get to the end of the scene, my ranger has shot off, who knows, probably like 8 arrows. I'll pick up my d6, I'll roll it. If I roll a 2 through 6, nothing happens. I'm able to recover most of my arrows. I still have a pretty full quiver. If I roll a 1, then it goes from a d6 to a d4. So now in later scenes in which I use the bow in the same way, I'll roll a d4 at the end of that scene. And it sort of abstractly represents an arrows breaking or not being able to find them, they're lost, etc. And having that, and not having to be like, okay, well I've used 7 of my 25 arrows, and not have to sort of do that bookkeeping aspect of it. Just kind of abstracting it, making it relatively simple, while still representing things like you can use it to represent stuff. We talked about sort of rappelling or climbing up a cliff face earlier. If we were rappelling down and maybe I had my ranger had some sort of mishap and got, fell a little bit and caught themselves on the rope and twisted around a little bit. The arrows might fall out of that quiver. Maybe as DM, I'd ask for a roll on that resource because the quiver's on their back. So as they flip upside down, they might all fall off, and then if they get down to the bottom of the cliff face, they've got to try to scramble and pick up all they are. Were they able to find them all? They might have spread all over the area. So it's just a very simple way to sort of add that mechanic in without making it very bookkeeping intensive, which is what I like. So very, very simple idea. And again, if you've seen me play the solo RPG series that we have, you've seen me interact with this mechanic a lot. And it makes sense. What I really like about the mechanic is that it provides a benefit for bringing things like pack animals or having vehicles with you, because they allow you to, like I said, you can carry up to a d6 on your back, but if you have an animal with you, you can now carry up to a d8. If you have a wagon with you, you can carry up to like a d10. If you have a ship, you might have a 12 if it's a really big ship or something. Or maybe even like a stronghold or something like that, you might have a d20 in there. And so that just sort of represents having these things and keeping them with you and making them part of your adventuring party have a mechanical benefit to you. That's less time, you have more time when you're out adventuring before you have to figure out a way to resupply yourselves. It also accounts for things, abstracting it to do things like food spoilage or not being able to find a good water source, or not being able to get as much good clean water as you thought you were going to be able to, and things of that nature. And then there are ways to interact with the world through exploration, like maybe as you're walking along, one of the things you decide to do is like, I'm not going to be doing my perception, but I'm going to do a nature check or a survival check or something to keep my eyes out for some sort of like edible wild plants that we can sort of pick up that can sort of complement our rations. So next time we make a rations check at the end of the day, we can roll with advantage. So it's less likely that we'll roll a 1, which allows us to go even further off of what we have because we're interacting with the world and using that mechanic to supplement that. And then if you don't want to do that, you just don't. Or it's more important to, you're afraid you're going to get ambushed, so you're like, actually, we're not going to do any of the side stuff. We're going to be 100% alert and focused on not being ambushed as we're going through maybe this dark elf forest or whatever it is that you're moving through. That's sort of the idea with it. And we were just talking about it, but let's go ahead and put it on here. We didn't really touch on it, but one of the things that I do like is scaling spells. And this is something that I wish was implemented in 2024. I would like to see that maybe revision to some of the magic system. This is kind of a... down here. I believe DCC has some of this, and Starfinder has some of this, and I think maybe... I think some of the Powered by the Apocalypse games have spells and abilities that kind of work like this. Whereas the idea is that as you grow in power, your spells grow with you. Now, for those who watch the cantrip video, then you might think that that's counterintuitive, considering I talked about some of the issues that I have with things like scaling cantrips. But I think that is lessened if all the spells also scaled. I really like, the one that really stands out to me in this, that I've had the most experience with, that I thought was really, really good, was Starfinder. It's the idea of, so imagine a world where instead of having Firebolt, Burning Hands, Flaming Sphere, and Fireball all as separate spells, those were all the same spell, and they were just different levels of the same spell. So it'd be like, instead of maybe Firebolt, we'll use like Produce Flame or something like that. So you go from being able to, as a low-level character, you're able to access sort of this level of the spell, and you can do fire magic. And then as you grow a little bit more, you're able to do something like Burning Hands and do a different type of fire magic. As you grow a little bit more, now you're able to do something like Flaming Sphere, where I can manifest that fire and keep it on the battlefield. And then the next step up is like, now I can make it into this big explosive attack. So it kind of gives you this idea of combining spells that you can level up. So now there's less sort of the wizard tax of things like, well, I need to keep track of, or I mean, any prepared caster has to keep track of tons of spells and try to figure out which spells they want to take. So rather than having this huge sort of litany of spells to choose from and trying to knock that down to, well, which 9 of my 40 spells do I want to prepare today? And that's when you don't, especially if it's a new adventuring day, you're not sure what sort of situation you're going to get into. That's really, really difficult. Whereas a system like Starfinder has a much more svelte spell list, but they all scale with power and allow you to do more things with them. And so they're a little bit more general use. Now it's like, I don't need to take, I think we're going to fight ice methods. That's not really a good example. Ice elementals, let's say, or water elementals. So it's like, I want to take fire spells, obviously. Or we're going to fight, let's do a troll. I know we're going to fight a troll today. So instead of taking a whole bunch of fire spells, I just take the one fire spell that has a whole bunch of different fire spell effects, and I can choose to cast them at different levels, kind of based off of the need of what I need in that moment. And that might have a different sort of mana pool choice or spell slot choice or whatever it is. It still gives me flexibility within the system of how much casting I can do in a day, but also the effects that I can do with this one spell, instead of having 4 or 5 different spells that kind of do a different flavor of, I do fire damage to the monster. DC-20 is a good reference for this. I haven't spent any time with DC-20 yet, but yeah, I think that it makes sense that there are a lot of other systems that incorporate this. I understand why D&D doesn't. D&D has to pay homage to a lot of its sort of 50-year legacy, that there's just sort of vestigial things from the olden days of the game that we just kind of keep around. The things like, why does Fireball need to be so powerful? Why is it so much more powerful than other spells at that same level? Well, because Fireball's always been a powerful spell. And that's the reason that's there. And it's really, there's not really any more to it than that, is that it's one of the iconic spells, so of course it should be more powerful than the other spells. Okay. But I also, because I don't have that legacy, that bloated legacy as a sort of like an albatross around my neck, or other systems don't have that we don't have to fall into that. We can use something that's got a more scalable sort of magic system. And I want that to be represented in maybe something that on the martial side as well. I don't know probably what that would look like. But I think having the scaling spells plus having that sort of unified mechanic with the stunts in it could be really, really powerful. Could be a really cool combination. Especially if part of what's in the sort of stunt tables is like, hey, you just treat the spell as if you cast it at a higher level if you want. If you don't want that effect, then you just don't spend the spell point. You don't spend the stunt points on that. If you're like, well, I'm going to shoot and produce flame and hurl it at somebody who's like 60 feet away, and they're like, well, you could bump it up and use burning hands, but burning hands won't hit that target. So you're like, well, I don't spend the stunt points on that. I spend the stunt points on other stuff. Maybe it just does more damage. Maybe I double cast the spell. That's one of the things I think the age system does. It allows you to just double cast the spell right off the bat. You're like, okay, well, instead of doing produce flame once, I'm able to quick cast and do produce flame twice and hurl it at 2 different people. Do fun stuff like that. So it gives you a lot of flexibility to sort of, no matter what the situation is, that gives you an opportunity not just to do more damage, but to do more stuff. And to have spells that are a little bit more versatile, because one of the things I feel like we run into, especially as you get higher and higher levels as a caster in D&D, you look at your spell list and there are a ton of very specific situation spells. They're like, do I prep this spell? And a lot of times, unfortunately, the mechanics of how it plays at the table, at least it's been my experience, is that I often don't know what's going to be coming up. And one of my favorite examples is, it's not Spare the Dying, it's Gentle Repose. And when you're looking at a low-level cleric, and you have to think, what sort of mind state do you need to be in as a cleric when you're sitting around the fire preparing your spells in the morning with your friends around you breaking camp, and you're like, well, I better get prepared Gentle Repose because I expect one of these people to die today. It's like that's a very specific mind frame for a character existing in that world as a cleric, as somebody like a cleric, which is very interesting, and I think it's very difficult to kind of parse that sometimes as a player. Like, how would that in-universe conversation go? Be like, oh, well, I was going to prepare this one spell, but instead I did Gentle Repose, and they'll be like, you were just expecting we were gonna die? Yeah, kinda. It's a very sort of negative attitude to have with your friends. It's very interesting. But yeah, so scaling spells, and I'll go ahead and put DC-20 down here too. I will trust that it has similar mechanics, like you said. Alright, yeah, this kind of goes in the same thing. A consolidated magic system or classes. I guess we're in the magic system, so we'll just go ahead and put this in magic notes. So technically we're in a different system. So we have the scaling spells, which I really like, and then consolidated magic system / classes. And I think we see this already in things like Pathfinder 2, the sidekicks use it in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. where essentially instead of having each different class have its own list of spells, you have the sort of a core 3-1, right? You have a divine, sorry, let's do it in alphabetical order. You have arcane, divine, and primal. So instead of having D&D a different spell list for every single class with a button, even though most of those are crossed over, there's only sort of very few spells that only specific classes get access to, and compared to sort of the general shareable spells. And so I do like this is sort of the Pathfinder 2 thing, which is that, are you doing arcane magic, are you doing primal magic, or are you doing divine magic? And that gives you access to what we might consider the main three, the big Neapolitan ice cream sandwich of magic casting. Is you got the arcane, you got the divine, you got the primal. So I do like that. Also add a cult for weird and wacky effects. That's true. I don't know. I guess for me, like, a cult generally falls in weird arcane stuff, or it could fall in divine stuff. I don't have strong feelings about divine magic being very particularly sort of like as we think of Judeo-Christian kind of miracles kind of thing. It's just, I think that the warlocks and divine characters are a lot closer in nature than is usually represented. And that kind of falls into exactly what we're talking about. So that's a consolidated magic sort of system, is having the three different sort of realms of magic, and then having the classes sort of boiled down to really the only difference of spellcasters are sort of the source of their power. So there's compact, there is innate, and there is learned. So very easy to probably figure out what classes are what kind of caster. And that's how they basically interact with magic. So I'll put that in here, how they interact with magic. Or how they, let's say, source or interact with magic. So it's very easy. So a compact, we can make this, we'll change this. We'll just say agreement. I always call it compact because I like the I think it's an evocative word, is what I'm trying to say. I think it's a very evocative term, but we'll say agreement. Or better yet, we'll call it borrowed. So what is borrowed? So that would fall into things like clerics. Pretty much all divine casters do this. Well, not all. Most divine casters do this. So we're talking about things like clerics. We're talking about warlocks. These are casters that are able to do magic because they have made some sort of agreement, whether that is faith and worship, or whether this is a literal contract that's been made between a warlock and their patron. But basically, you are able to invoke magic in the world because you are pulling that magic from a separate source, from a separate sentient creature somewhere. That's where you're sort of pulling this magic from. It is borrowed power. It's not a power that you have necessarily, because those would be innate casters. And this pretty much is just sorcerers. And pretty much anybody who falls into it. Very much anybody sorcerers. We could also do things like elves, gnomes, fey creatures. Pretty much anybody who just has magic. So if you were playing a high elf and you get that one extra cantrip, well, you're sort of like an innate caster, right? You have magic suffuses who you are and your people. So that's sort of the build up, is that there's nothing you really do. It's just kind of a feel. It's like sorcerers. It's that you just kind of do it. You don't have to pray to a god or sign a contract with a demon. You just start manifesting this power. I mean, if we follow traditional fantasy, usually when you're going through some sort of adolescence, when your body is changing, and then you're also untap things like magical abilities and things like that. And so it's very much a sort of feel rather than a science. It's an art rather than a science of casting. And then we have learned casters, which are primarily art wizards. Basically, anybody who, the way that they are able to source their magic and cast spells is not because they've borrowed it from some sort of extraplanar entity. They haven't made some sort of compact or accordance or agreement, so they don't have to pay anything for this power. They're not innate casters, which means that they're not just born with the gift to be able to do magic. They don't have that sort of that artistic ability to just kind of be creative and think and move, and then magic happens. Like something like sorcerers or creatures that have that innate magical ability where magic just literally flows through their veins. They can't really turn it off even if they wanted to. They are learned casters. These are the people who are the theoretical, or I guess not theoretical, they are the practical physicists of magic. They're like, we have done a lot of studying, we understand the interaction of magic with our plane of existence and other planes of existence, and I know how to, using basically science and math, use that sort of resource to create a specific effect. And I have to learn how to do that. And so that's sort of the difference. And so the idea is that each of these will come, depending on which sort of tradition you come into it, has its bonuses and its downfalls. So one of those, these are example ones, so they're not set in stone. For borrowed, is that you get to be a prepared caster, which is helpful. That's sort of one of the major things. You're prepared. I would also say a ritual caster, which means they get a lot of choice as to what sort of spells or powerful effects that they feel like they're going to need. They can ask their entity for those sort of specific things, and they can also do things like rituals to be able to summon up greater power to themselves. So that's sort of the idea there. And sort of something that might be a downside is that you have to fulfill a contract. There are some downsides to it, is that, and we play with the idea that extraplanar entities are fully inhuman. So they have minds that don't work like ours, they have weird requests. There is something you have to do to receive this magic from that extraplanar creature. It could be you have to pray, you have to follow the tenets of your religion, and be a paragon of virtue as far as the faith is concerned, and there's going to be some specific tenets of things you can do, things you must do, and things you can't do. And if you break those things, there's a chance that you will have your power diminished, or even have the opportunity to lose the power. Or if it's something like a warlock, the devil might call in your deal and be like, well, you didn't fulfill the contract, so I'm taking your soul right now, kind of thing. So it does give them, if anybody's familiar with I guess it's a bit of an older sort of anime now. If you've ever seen Darker Than Black or read the manga, they have similar, where people have weird abilities, but they have to pay a toll to use that ability, and sometimes it seems like very, very weird things that they have to do. I think there's a person that has to fold over the corner of every page in a book, And so that's just a thing that they have to do. Like I said, these are inscrutable extraplanar entities, which gives us a lot of leeway to be like, here's just a weird thing that you have to do to continue to have access to your power, which gives you a lot of like flavor as a caster based off of whatever entity you're praying to or made a contract with. For somebody like innates, they're gonna get a little bit more. They're flexible casters. That represents a little bit more things like meta magic, ways that they're able to change and alter spells, and those sorts of things. But the problem is that they can't learn magic. So what that means is that it's really unlikely that they're going to be able to use something like a spell scroll because their understanding of magic doesn't work like that. There's nothing they can read on the page that's going to teach them how to do magic, because that's not how they interact with magic at a very sort of innate personal level. It's sort of the trade-off, so they can't do that. They can't do ritual magic. They can't do... So I'll put that down here. They can't just... They're not like wizards where they can go out and literally learn new spells by reading other people's spells and be able to add that to their knowledge. And I think that there is a... They can't... So let's do that. They can't do ritual magic. And I'm going to say... And there's this sort of idea that in addition to not being able to do... how do I want to say that? I can't do ritual magic. And I think that there's an element of randomness to their spell choice. I don't know what that is yet. Something that I might do that kind of falls within that realm is that I played with a DM a few years ago. We were playing more of an old school kind of thing. But one of the things that he did and that I really kind of liked as we were playing an OSR thing is that you have a pretty limited amount of spells that you get to choose from at low levels. At first level as a wizard in most OSR games, including the one we were playing. And so I think you get a choice of like 1 or 2 spells that you can have. And he was like, well, you can choose 2 spells or I'll let you roll like 1d6 plus 1 random spells from the list, or whatever the spell list is. It's like, and you can have a number of random spells. So I wanted something that is more like that for something like a sorcerer, where it kind of reflects just their innate ability to do it. It's just like, this is just a thing you've learned how to do, whether it's that you found to be useful, and even though it might not be the specific spell that you might want to take, or if you really focus on how do I make this one effect happen, but you're not a learned caster, so you don't have that sort of foundational knowledge or references to sort of work off of. So being like, you can choose a very specific spell that you want, but you can have much fewer spells, or you can have a larger sort of repertoire of spells that you can cast, but you don't get to choose those spells. So it's this sort of trade-off between randomness and choice. And then for learned casters, of course, they have the same thing where they can do rituals and they can learn spells. They do the very classic wizard thing where it's like, if they find a spell scroll or a wizard's spell book in the wild, they can copy those spells over and turn them into their own. So that gives them the ability to have a lot more spells at their disposal than anybody else. But the downside of that is that it takes money and time. It takes a lot of money and time to be a wizard. You gotta have components for your spells, where they might have more of a tax on the material components of the spells. And they might have, because they have the ability to access rituals. They're going to be doing a lot more ritual casting, so they can save that sort of spell slots. So it's very similar to sort of how rituals work in contemporary D&D, where it's like, if you decide to do this as a ritual, it takes time, and that time is the resource you are spending rather than your spell slot, mana pool, whatever it is. So it gives them the idea. So wizards are very powerful. They have a lot of flexibility. They're really nice to have in the party. But they are kind of a money and time sink when you're adventuring. So having this idea that you have this magic system, and these both the source and the sort of spell list. I'll just go ahead and make that explicit up here. Consolidated. Consolidated spell list. So you can have any one of those things can be matched. So you can have, that basically gives you the ability to access, what's that, 6 different classes? No, it's gotta be more than that, right? That's 9 different arrangements, essentially. Because you can have an arcane borrowed caster, you can have an arcane innate caster, an arcane learned caster, and the same for divine, and the same for primal. So it gives you this, now you have, essentially, through those combinations, 9 different classes that you can play. So if you want to, what gives you a lot of flavor, gives you a lot of flexibility for choosing what sort of character you want to play, but it also gives you a lot of flavor depending on whatever spell list you take and whatever source list you take as to what that character is gonna look like. Where an arcane innate caster is going to be our very classic sort of sorcerer example, where something like a learned primal one would be something that's a little bit more druidic. Or if you wanted to do divine borrowed, that would kind of put you, in my mind, a little bit closer to something like the classic warlock, even though it's a warlock, or what you might call sort of like a dread cultist or priest or something like that, that kind of falls into that area. Which, when you're talking about sort of adding occultness in there, that's how I consolidate that and be like, hey, you have made this sort of pact with some sort of extraplanar being, and you were trying to do that, and maybe one of the tenets that the creature has given you in exchange for this power is for you to fundamentally like start a cult or start like a small religion to get them worshippers, because that presumably gives that extra planar creature more power, and they can in turn give you more power. And now you have this very sort of in-universe mechanical reason why there's a bunch of evil cultists all over the place, which is a really cool thing for a system to do. So yeah, that's that. Let's do we talked about that. That was the next thing on my list, was the sort of borrowed innate learned caster thing. So yeah, and the next one I want to talk about is having sort of a consolidated, very similar, so consolidated class / archetypes. So as we saw with sort of like the casters, we already kind of broke that down, where we only have, a couple decisions you make, and based off of whatever those 2 decisions are, you end up with essentially 9 very flavorful, not the same classes of caster. And so I want to consult that I don't really have much of an issue with sort of the core 3, that's, the OG D&D, and for classes. I like fighter, I like I'm going to call them expert, or let's just use the Tasha Cauldron for everything. So you have warrior, expert, and mage. I like those consolidated classes. I think that makes sense. And instead of having necessarily a divine healer or something like that, that's the type of mage who gets access to healing is going to be dependent on whatever spell list you choose. And there may be limited healing in all of them, though we would expect, of course, there to be the most healing in Divine, with some healing in Primal, and very little healing in sort of the Arcane side of the spells list. But, that's just initial thoughts. Who knows what it could turn out to be in the end. But I do like this. And so instead we have consolidated classes. You get the 3 big classes. If you do that, you go into this whole thing, and then having sort of flavorful archetypes. Yeah. And of course, this is sort of like honestly, is mostly just a revision back to very, very old school D&D, where it's like, oh, you're going to be a fighter, but that might also mean that you can subclass into something like Paladin or Ranger. So, you have something like Warrior that can go into sort of a Ranger. Do we really want And anyways, I was trying to figure out how I want to talk about this. Barbarian, because a lot of this stuff is me that I've internalized or I've written down, and now I'm trying to explain it to other people, and that's always a little bit of, I understand what I mean, but can I say it in a way that I think other people will understand what I mean? So you have this sort of warrior. We'll just do that. So you get the ability to do barbarian. You get the identity to do fighter. You can do ranger. You can do something like paladin. So rather than those all be explicitly totally different classes, be like, they all kind of do the same thing, which is mostly stand in the front and hit something with a weapon most of the time, with various arrays of armor. Or if you're something like the ranger, you sit back and use a bow instead, but you're still sort of a weapon user kind of idea. And the other thing is having a let's say progression choices. And I'll say progression options that include all 3 pillars of play. So the thing that I think that 5e in 2024 doesn't necessarily do a good job of is that because the game is very clearly very combat focused, more than 2/3 of the game is focused almost primarily on combat. And because of that, most of the character options that you come across are very combat focused options for the most part. Especially for something like a fighter build. You don't get a lot of cool exploration stuff you get to do. They don't really give you any social stuff that you get to do. You're just the guy that sits in the corner in the heavy armor and waits around until the monsters show up, and then I hit them with the stick. So I want something that's got a little bit more progression options, so things that give you the option to do combat, things that give you, we'll say, discovery, which is more exploration, but also investigation. And give them some social things. And give them some sort of abilities, or the option to be abilities is that if you wanted to play a very sort of court intrigue more game, a game that's more social and maybe doesn't have a ton of combat in there, it gives you this ability you can play somebody who is a warrior style class, but still have abilities that are going to be useful in social situations. So give them the ability that's like, well, I could take, this is a bad example, but extra attack, or I could do this thing that maybe helps me when I'm doing intimidations or things like that for social situations. Or gives me this option that if I wanted to make it more equitable, instead of having an extra attack, maybe a walkback thing that allows you to like re-roll a charisma check, something that's like, well, I'm just a poor, simple country boy kind of thing. Very sort of southern archetype lawyer kind of thing, where I'm but a humble warrior, but this is my thoughts on the issue. and have the ability to do that and have that experience and that point of view make sense and be impactful for more of a social situation that feels flavorful and thematic for the class. So you could end up with a class that if you took the warrior class and you decided, I'm going to take all social stuff, and now you have this person who's like, you can envision them being in sort of like a king's court or something like that, and they're, it's the Margrave from wherever, and they're well respected and a famed warrior, but they're also a very adept sort of social player in the court. Yeah, social for combatant classes include leadership skills, interrogation skills. Yeah, I don't want to make it too, because I think I do like kind of, also this is sort of a 4E thing. I really enjoyed the Warlord class, and a lot of people really love the Warlord class from that edition of the game. And unfortunately, there isn't really, you see vestiges of it in the stuff in 5e, like under the Battlemaster, some of that stuff in there. But it's very cool. I remember playing the 4th edition of the game, and I had really crappy dice luck for a while, and I wanted to break the streak, so I was like, I'm going to build a character where I try to roll as few times as possible in a game. And the Warlord has a bunch of cool abilities that allow you on your turn to like give other people attacks and do other things and have this sort of things outside of combat. So I built sort of like this physically meek kind of Warlord, but is sort of like a master tactician. So he is somebody who is sort of a man in the chair kind of archetype, where it's like, I'm not a particularly good fighter, but I know how to make the best use of the strong fighters I have around me idea. But yeah, absolutely. Leadership skills, interrogation skills, spycraft, all sorts of interesting stuff like that. Being able to, just like when people who are veterans in the real world meet with each other and they immediately kind of have a shared experience bond, you can do that with the fighters and warriors, things like that. Kind of give them these options where they have a specific group of people that they're more influential with, or that they're less influential with, kind of based off of who they are and maybe their backgrounds and things like that. But yeah, very much that. So I do want that sort of consolidated thing where in the expert you run into things. That's going to include, and you can also include the rangers in the expert class if you want to go full sort of tracker wilderness guide. Very much a very classic Lord of the Rings ranger kind of thing, where it's like, yeah, they fight too, but really they're best when they're sort of exploring and doing the overland travel, and that's where they really, really shine because of all the bonuses they kind of bring to the party. This is why you want somebody like this in your party when you're doing this very specific type of game. Let's see, after that. Yeah, so I want let's go down here. I want So I want a nice, tight skill proficiency list. I think 5e's skill list is pretty decent. There are a lot of tools, though. There are a lot of extra weird proficiencies. Sorry, I didn't mean to make that. So, let's make that. There we go. So, I do think that 5e's is pretty good. Let's say approximate value, or let's say volume of skills. I think 5e hits a pretty natural rhythm with its skills. I think you can look at a 5e character and be like, there are a few skills that don't get used very often. But that's not necessarily the issue of the system itself, but really the adventures that are run within that system. Because I think about it and it's like, well, animal handling doesn't come up very often in most games that I play, if at all. Sometimes, sure, there's the occasional, like, we run into a wild beast and we do our Jurassic World impression where we're like, ooh, like holding out for the raptors. We do that, but outside of that, even when it comes to doing something, if you're not riding horses, which I feel like doesn't happen in a lot of D&D campaigns, though I wish it happened more, or animal handling would be more important for like taking care of the horses and things of that nature, and we don't really have anything that kind of supports that kind of play. And then you also have, at the same time, where does animal handling end and things like land vehicle proficiency start? So when I am driving a wagon, I'm making vehicle proficiency checks, but I'm also interacting primarily with the animal that's doing it. I'm handling that animal, so there's some weird kind of overlaps there sometimes, where it's kind of like, I don't really understand why we have land vehicle proficiency most of the time. I think it's more likely, it's been my experience at least, my personal experience, that having water vehicle proficiency is much more useful than land vehicle proficiency. Because usually, there's not a lot of DMs who are going to sort of grouse about you being like, oh, well, I just jump onto the seat at the front of the wagon and just snap the reins and we take off. Just under the basic assumption that if nothing's happening, of course, a random person in the world knows how to drive a wagon, which is probably pretty true. Most people in an area where the primary means of transportation and transport of items and goods is primarily done by animal. So it makes sense that a lot of people would have or have a farmer background or something like that. A lot of people are going to have a lot of experience with animals. So then you're like, hey, where does... It's a very weird sort of like a mix-up. So I think that there's some tightening that can be done there. You have the things like, where does perception stop and investigation start? And why are these tied to two different ability scores? There's a lot of wibbly-wobbly gray matter in between some of the skills, but it's really sometimes kind of hard to determine what you should be rolling, and that can be difficult for a DM. Usually for me, perception is your chance of noticing something. Investigation is usually like you are looking for something, like you have a specific thing that you are looking for, whereas perception is just like you notice something that seems out of sorts, just at cursory inspection. That's like when you're like, oh, I just noticed that door's open. That's a perception check. You're like, I'm trying to find the secret lever that opens the door. That's an investigation check. That's my personal sort of where I make that distinction, but I think it's different for every DM. And I was a horse soldier in the army, Kaisen platoon, the old guard, Presidential Honor Guard. That's where I learned to drive a coach. Yep, that makes sense. Yeah, if you were a horse soldier, or you were like in part of the baggage train, like you were part of the sort of support troop, that would make sense. Anything like that, absolutely makes sense. So yeah, I like the volume of skills there, but I think it's maybe like tighten up some of the non-skill proficiencies. Like it does feel a little bit weird to me that there's like the poison maker's kit and the alchemist kit and the brewing kit, and there's a lot of overlap between those three skills and things like that. And your game design perception is tied to initiative. Yeah, that is something I like. This is another weird 4E thing. I know people bang on 4E, but it has a lot of really cool ideas. I understand that and I feel like the people who are the loudest detractors of 4E are the people who did not play that game very much, if at all, sometimes. Where you have things in 4E, I talked about when we have those static defenses. you could use either or. They gave you an option of whatever ability score you wanted to use to it, so you would take whatever ability score was the best for you. So I could definitely see a world in which wisdom, perception, and dexterity and initiative are kind of the same role, and you either take the best of those two roles or maybe the worst of those two roles, because you can definitely be very graceful and agile, but not have a lot of awareness of your surroundings. Just as conversely, you might notice what's about to happen, but you're not very quick on the draw. Right? You don't have super good reflexes. You recognize something's about to happen, but you're not super quick at like getting your sword out or whatever it is to get prepared for it and make a strike. So, yeah, it's sort of a balancing act. So I do like some of this. I just don't know quite where that would fit in my ideal constructed system. I don't quite know where those two would fit. But I do want to tighten up some of those non-skill proficiencies. Which is weird because I feel like in my own DM binder, I'm not going to grab it, it's in my bag right next to me, my game bag. I actually broke out or grouped up some of the proficiencies. So instead of having proficiencies for like every single type of instrument, I was like, okay, you have proficiencies. If you're traveling, you have spent enough either as a minstrel or a bard that you have gotten proficiency with something like stringed instruments, like you can play the viol. That there's so much transferable skills between that and another stringed instrument that I'm just like, you just have proficiency in stringed instruments. You can play pretty most stringed instruments. Just like if you can play violin, it takes some work, but you can also play viola, you can play cello, you can play string bass. Like these are all things that are very similar. You can play guitar, you can play all these other sort of stringed instruments because they have so many transferable skills, and you understand like how the neck works as far as where notes are, and that's sort of the important part. So there's a lot of sort of like consolidation we can do, and I did that primarily to make it an easy 1d50 roll for skills and proficiencies. If I ever need a random skill or proficiency that somebody is trained in, then I have a nice easy table that I can roll off of it, rather than trying to give them very small specific ones. Just same way that card and dice games are, I feel, can be pulled in together, as well as things like board games. It's like you can kind of pull those all together, because if you understand sort of basic game design and understand the basic statistics of different things and actions, you're going to be a more competent gamer, whether you're playing with dice cards or something like Nyman Morris or something like that, drafts, checkers, things. It's like you have enough foundational game knowledge, game design knowledge to understand how to be better at that game than the average person might be. So I do that. Yeah, under the gambling skill. That would be a good one. But then you have a weird thing is like, if you have a generic gambling skill, is like, does that skill also translate to being like playing carnival games or something like that, or playing darts? Is that is that the same? Because you might decide that falls under a gambling skill, you might decide that doesn't. So gambling is, you have to, that's one of the, I think, the most difficult things with skill and proficiencies, is that you have to give that a very succinct but very clear a title that has a lot of clarity as to what this falls under, which is to avoid those sort of like perception versus investigation kind of situations, animal handling versus land vehicle proficiency, to reduce the amount of gray space that's kind of in between or overlap between a lot of skills. So I want to tighten up some of those non-skill proficiencies, and I also want so this is a weird thing that D&D 5e specifically does, but then doesn't ever actually tell anybody about in most cases. Divorced ability score, or ability mods, let's do that. And skill proficiencies, or we'll just say proficiency bonuses. So if anybody's played World of Darkness, and this is very much, I mean, it's in a lot of systems, but World of Darkness is probably the one that I think of as the most famous, or really, I guess most skill systems kind of focus it like this. Is that similar as you were talking about with sort of like initiative and being like that's a perception check versus a dexterity check. And this is something that 5e does natively, and that's why it's very clear about you make an ability check, and then if you have the skill, you can add the skill to it, because they swap things around a little bit. But one of the sort of things that they've kind of built into 5e, but they're not very explicit about usually talking about it, or they weren't during this sort of 10-year run, is that you can already mix and match ability scores and proficiencies. So if you want to do, let me think of something. This is one of the things where it's like, if you do that, that allows you to trim up the skill list a little bit, because now you don't need to have an athletics and an acrobatics skill. You can just have an athletic skill. And like, if you're trying to do an acrobatics maneuver that is a dexterity, you add your dexterity mod and athletics instead of your strength mod and athletics. So it gives you this ability to sort of mix and match different ability scores and different proficiencies, which means that you can actually create situations where you can make very bespoke checks for very specific situations without having this gigantic list of skills, because you can have a smaller list of skills, but none of those skills or tools or anything are tied to a specific ability score, which is sometimes where people run into difficulty. Games run into difficulty with things like the proficiency list, especially for like tools, because often they're not really explicit about like what ability score you're supposed to roll with a tool proficiency. You're like, okay, I'm gonna craft an item. Is that an intelligence check to craft the item? Even though I have this, maybe I have this toolkit because it's tied to my class, and maybe my class is something that's not intelligence based, so I don't really have a good intelligence modifier. But it makes sense that maybe I have used something else for it. Do I use strength to forge it when I'm smithing? Do I use the constitution because it's just something that takes a long time to do, and I just need to sort of knuckle down and do it? So it gives you a little bit more flexibility as to how you mix and match those things for very specific situations. So you might say, let's do animal handling. Let's see if we can come up with an animal handling check that would make sense for all the different ability scores. Okay, strength, animal handling. That could be something like if you're riding a horse and the horse is spooked and you're trying to saw on the reins and get it back under control. Maybe that's a strength check. Maybe you're like, yeah, make me a strength animal handling check, because as you're physically trying to get your horse back under control using your muscles by sawing on the reins and digging in. So you could do something like that. Dexterity, hey, you want to hop in or out of the saddle quickly? Like quick riding? That seems like a very useful thing. You want to jump out of that second story window onto your waiting horse underneath the window? That sounds like a good dexterity animal handling check. But you could also say that might be a dexterity athletics check. Though I'd probably say animal handling because you're involving an animal with it. Constitution. These are all very riding specific, so let's do something that's not riding. What would be a good constitution animal handling check? What could be a good constitution animal handling check? That is riding again, though. Is doing something like breaking a horse or doing some sort of like rodeo action where you're riding an angry bull, right? That's not necessarily more about strength or dexterity, and it has a lot to do with it, dexterity, but it also is just sort of enduring, because it's a very timed event. You just need to endure this with your constitution. Something like that. Let's say intelligence. Intelligence animal handling would be any sort of animal husbandry thing. Like, hey, can you recognize what's wrong with this animal? Is this animal good breeding stock? That's when you're inspecting a horse before you buy it, trying to figure out so you don't get somebody doesn't grift you and sell you a nag or something, or a painted up horse or something like that. You can actually inspect it and feel like you know what that is. You could argue that's a nature check, but I think that makes more sense if you're looking to purchase like livestock. That's more of an animal handling, animal husbandry kind of background kind of check, rather than, oh, well, I know nature, which encapsulates a lot more things like understanding ecological biomes and recognizing flowers and stuff like that. So I think you could definitely put that under intelligence animal handling. Wisdom animal handling. The easiest thing to do that is just the same way that we do sort of like an insight. So insight's usually meant for trying to determine, or how it's practically used is trying to determine whether somebody's being on the level with you, trying to figure out whether they're being honest with you about the information they're communicating to you. But you could do a wisdom animal check, animal handling check to do things like when you come across a wild animal, trying to read that their posture, their body movement, try to understand, like, is it being hostile? Do I need to, and sort of like the commonplace thing, like, is this a situation where I try to make myself seem like a bigger animal, or is this a situation where I try to make myself look meek and small and non-threatening? Is this an animal where I need to make eye contact, or definitely don't make eye contact with? Is this animal right? That's probably more of a nature check if it's right for the area. But trying to figure out, like, oh, are we maybe close to a den? Is that why it's acting this way? And maybe it's got a baby somewhere. It's got a litter somewhere. And just those sorts of things. Where insight, you could use insight in that, but insight to me feels very much communication based, and that includes, like, somebody is actively kind of, a humanoid is trying to tell you something, or a creature that can communicate is trying to tell you something, rather than you trying to intuit a lot of sort of weird body language from a creature that's not like another humanoid, if that makes sense. And then charisma, yeah, no, maybe let's just go with the same example. So you've looked at this and you're like, oh, I made a good check, so I believe that I need to make myself look large, and now I can do maybe a charisma animal handling. Maybe that's intimidation, maybe it's not. Again, there's still going to be those gray areas where the skills kind of bleed over each other, so then you have to kind of determine what you can do to sort of reduce those gray areas. So we would change up some of the skill lists, maybe change up some of the proficiencies to have as little of that bleed over effect where DMs and players are trying to figure out which combination of things to roll, and where a lot of potential combinations could also fit into the same mix. So trying to reduce some of that. That's right. That's all of them. Yeah, strength, dex, con, int, whiz, cha. So yeah, it absolutely does work that way. You went with an observation skill that covers perception, investigation, and sense motive. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I can definitely see that. And I think one of the things that I struggle with, especially with some of the skill descriptions with something like perception, is like 5e has very loose language around it about where a skill doesn't necessarily mean formal training in something, but something you've learned through experience. And normally I wouldn't have an issue with that, but when you have a proficiency, something you're trained in, and that's how we use that term, trained, even if that's experience trained. The idea that it also continues to go up, regardless of what you do within the adventure. Right, when you hit that next proficiency bump, you're like, well, now I'm just better at observing, but when you give yourself that sort of weasel out to be like, well, it's not formal training, I think that actually hurts your case for it going up in the proficiency bonus rather than help it. Instead, it could be like, well, you hung out with this ranger for a long time, and they kind of told you the ins and outs of the animals as you came across them. It's like, hey, here's a brown bear. You want to make sure you make yourself look small for a brown bear that's opposed to a black bear, where you might want to make yourself look bigger and more intimidating. And there's a very easy way to just be like, well, this is just something I picked up from a person. And that includes sort of formal education, in my mind. Even though it's not sort of book, desk, sitting in a classroom education. Some skills can be very versatile, where optional ability scores can be added for distinct effects. Strength with a hard attack, grace for precision attack, speed for a fast attack. Yeah, and I think we do see a lot of that. It's really difficult because modern D&D is very... It really hurts strength a lot. There's not a lot of good reasons to make a strength build character in a lot of circumstances, unless you're going for a very specific type of build. When you have, you know, your dex-based fighters and paladins who can do very similar things and have a great AC and not have to deal with the problems of heavy armor to increase their AC. And all the issues that come with that, like not being able to swim very well, and rust monsters, and etc., etc. Which, to me, puts another feather in the cap of why armor should be DR. And it's like, well, now armor, everybody wants to wear armor because it stops damage. And when you don't have a ton of hit points, that's a lot more important. Rather than just increasing the hit points that all classes get. I think you can make a case for, at this point in how D&D is progressing and its sort of future trajectory for game design, is that if we weren't so married to that legacy of D&D where we have to have 6 ability scores, I could see a world in which strength and constitution just got rolled in together and be like, this is like your brawn, or however you want to call it. You just kind of roll those in together and to give it a little bit more, because constitution doesn't really do a ton in most of the game, besides your one really useful saving throw that comes up a lot, but there's no skills tied to it, anything like that. And there's a lot of crossover between something that's like a strength athletics check versus a constitution athletics check, whether you're running long distance or just trying to, I think you could do something like whether you're free climbing, which is both a functional strength thing, but it is also like extended strength for a long period of time, which is more of a stamina thing, which puts it more under constitution. So there's already, those two scores are already a little wibbly wobbly, very close. You're not too enveloped in D&D, you haven't played since 1E. Yeah, well, the new editions are, I mean, the 5th edition 5e 2024 is good. It's good at what it does. It just depends if you want to play that kind of game. But it does have some weird stuff in it, which is the things we're talking about, obviously. Let's see. So we did scaling spells, archetypes, the divested abilities and proficiency skills, which I really like. Oh, I do want to do this. This is technically under combat, so we gotta put it up here before we get to the matching notes. And we're gonna add it before the resource mechanic, even though the resource die mechanic is used for a lot of stuff outside of combat. I want to talk about exploding damage dice. So would exploding damage dice gel with the 3d6 stunt system? I don't know. That's definitely like a weird. This is a design option that once you get into playtesting, it's probably going to become real clear really fast whether that's a good or bad idea. It's just like, oh well, you can't have the stunt mechanics and the exploding dice because then things are just off the rails immediately, so you really need to focus in on maybe one or the other, and focus on either having exploding damage dice or having crit dice that give you extra damage or things like that. So, but I do like exploding damage dice. So if for whatever reason you're not familiar with exploding damage dice, exploding dice mechanics, they're in tons of games, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about it because I feel like most of us probably are already familiar with it. But exploding damage dice is basically roll the max, die result max, roll again. continue as necessary. You see this in mechanics I watched recently, or if you've played it, because I think the free quick start or PDF is out for Never Stop Blowing Up, the Dimension 20 sort of system that's kind of cribbed from Kids on Bikes or Kids on Brooms, where they have an exploding dice system. That's used for checks, however. We're like, oh, well, because they have abilities that are tied to certain die sizes and they scale, kind of like the resource die mechanic. Except without it going down when you roll a 1. Instead, it explodes when you roll a max result. So if I was rolling, and actually some of the 2024 spells now do that, where they're like, hey, if you roll max result on, I can't remember which spell I used. I only used it like maybe a month ago, when we were playing a one-shot, and I was trying out some of the new 2024 stuff. And it's a spell that does 3d8, and I can't remember what the damage... It's a lightning spell. I know that, because that's what's jumping, I think. And you're like, oh, well, if you roll max damage on any of the d8s, you get to jump the spell to another target and reroll the d8. And you get to keep doing that as long as there are targets in range, and you only hit one of the targets. There's no duplicates. You can't hit the same target over and over again. But it is a really cool spell, and gives you this... I had a knock-on effect where I was able to hit, I think, 3 different creatures with the same spell attack, which was really cool, very flavorful, feels real good at the table, feels really good at play. Like, hey, this cool random thing happened, and we got to do all this extra cool stuff because of it. Which is very in line with sort of how the stunt system works in game. It's like, hey, I rolled doubles, so now I get to do the cool things. Very similar. So yeah, I like the roll die result max. This is sort of a question, and we'll just put it down here. Might have issues with the 3d6 stunt system, and that's assuming that if I was making my own system, that I was going to use the 3d6 stunt system as sort of the core foundational thing. Which I still don't know. I'm just saying that I like the system and I like what that system does, and I think that I like that system. At the table, rolling dice is more exciting than rolling a d20 and hoping that I get that 5% chance of rolling a natural 20, but also that only really impacts attack rolls. So if I'm not doing an attack roll, if I'm casting a spell and now there's a spell save, it's one of the things that I also want. When it's your turn, you get to roll the dice, because it really sucks when you're like, oh, I roll a damage, and the trade-off is on a save I also give those people half damage, but I don't have the opportunity to crit on that damage, or if they roll a 1, they also don't get double damage. So there's some of those effects don't seem to fully translate across all aspects of the combat side of the game for me. So, but roll the die result max, keep rolling, which is really nice, where you have, oh, I'm swinging my 1d6 short sword and I roll a 6, cool, I get to roll more. I do it, and I do it again, and I do it again, and now it represents much more powerfully the ability for somebody like a rogue who gets some extra sneak attack dice. This now represents a large amount of damage if I keep rolling 6s on the sneak attack damage. But it also is like, we don't have to roll as many dice. We don't have to immediately start off with 2d6 and go up to whatever. I don't even know what sneak attack taps out at. 8d6 for sneak attack? Is that what it taps out at? I can't remember off the top of my head. But instead of having 8d6 that you're rolling for like every attack you have advantage with when you're doing your backstab or sneak attack, being like, oh, well, you have maybe up to 3 dice. Maybe you get 1 per tier. If we were doing a standard like 4-tier sort of thing, it's like, oh, well, in the first tier, levels 1 through 4, you get to roll your damage plus an extra d6. And then 5 through 10 plus 2d6. And then plus tier 3, your 3d6. Tier 4, 4d6. And with the exploding damage, every time that I roll a 6, whether it's on the weapon die or the sneak attack damage, it blows up and I roll again. And so it gives you this opportunity, because the more dice I roll, the more likely it is I'm going to explode, which means there's more damage that I'm going to dish out. It's really useful, and I feel like matches the in-game idea, where it's like you're going for that critical strike, and like when you really hit it, you really hit it, and when you just kind of hit it, you just kind of hit it, or they know to protect themselves from their vulnerability spot, those sorts of things. So I like that, and I think that that's a very flavorful way in which the mechanics and the theme of the character you're playing together kind of fit together, where a lot more, where it's a little bit more exceptional, even though it happens more often than something like a crit does, where there's only a 5% chance that you're going to actually do extra damage. Whereas something with the stun system, there's more likely you're going to roll doubles on 3 dice. It's more likely you're going to roll an 8 on an 8, or whatever it is. Smaller damage dice are more likely to blow up, but they also just do lower damage overall. So when you're comparing a spell or a weapon that does 1d4 versus 1d8, you're like, well, I have to blow up, I have to do basically the max result on the d4 to get roughly the average damage that I get out of a d8, where they're pretty close. So yeah, I'm probably going to use the larger weapon, but if I was able to get in a situation where I rolled like a magic missile situation or something like that, where I'm rolling more smaller dice, then maybe I'll do that, because there's more likelihood that I'll blow up. It's a very sort of balancing act. So it really makes a damage sort of quadratic curve, which is really interesting. I really like. Are the documents created and the broadcast posted anywhere? They will be in the video. I haven't been posting them anywhere, but once we pass maybe that 500 mark for maybe channel subscribers, or maybe that's something I add over to the coffee, that could be something that we do in the future. If maybe I'll just make these documents available, because we don't always use these documents whenever I'm doing a broadcast, but sometimes we do. So that's something I could do, but right now, no plans for it. But like I said, we're getting pretty close to the channel membership level, so that's a nice, easy thing that if there are people who are interested in the content and want to support it, that I can make available for you guys. But as of right now, unfortunately not. So that was... I really thought I was going to run through these. I have like multiple pages of these. I'm going to have to do another stream of this, I think, because we're already past 2 hours. So I'm gonna have to figure this out. We're gonna have to figure out a stopping place. Ooh, yeah. No, I definitely want to talk about this next one, because this is something that I first came across in that same Dragon Age system that I really, really like. And then we'll do the pop-up, pop-down avoidance. Or, let's do that first. This technically goes into the combat field. So one of the things that I have an issue with, and I know tons of people have issues with, is the pop-up, pop-down, or let's say pop-up, knockdown play of 5e, and that's how 5e plays. So we'll put it right here. This resource die mechanic again doesn't really fit under here. So for those of you who haven't played a lot of contemporary D&D or don't really know too much about the system in the way that it deals with death, once you are reduced to 0 hit points, you go unconscious and begin making death saving throws on your turn. This is compared to especially older editions, super old editions, when you're like, you hit 0 and you're dead. It doesn't do that. There's a mechanic there where you are now not really engaging with the game, but you might die if nobody does anything to help you, or you might stabilize. So once you hit 0, if you are not reduced to your maximum HP in negatives within 1 attack, then that's the only way to kill somebody outright, which is perfectly easy to do at the very low levels of D&D. But once you get into sort of the mid levels, when characters start having, the upper teens, or certainly into the triple digits, where it's like the likelihood that one attack is going to do that much damage to you, even if you're close to 0, is going to do your full HP's worth of damage, is incredibly unlikely in one attack. Incredibly unlikely. Now, there's still things like Disintegrate and stuff like that that just kill people. They still have some of that. But for the most part is that once you get reduced to 0, you're unconscious, You make, when it's your turn, you make a death saving throw, which is just a straight d20 check. If you roll 10 or better, you get a success. If you roll 1 through 9, or what I should say is 2 through 9, you get a failure. On a 1, it's a double failure, so you have 3 death saving throws. If you roll a natural 1, you lose 2 of them. So there are many occasions in which somebody with 1 failed death saving throw rolls a natural 1 and just straight up dies before anybody gets a chance to basically heal them or stabilize them or do something that keeps them from not having to make death saves anymore. But functionally what happens at the table is that you go down to 0, the healer, your cleric or whoever it is there uses something like Healing Word. Healing Word gives you, 1d4 hit points. Which just basically means whenever you take damage next, there's a high likelihood that you're going unconscious again. So then, and there's no detriment for going into being unconscious multiple times. Right, you pop up. Each future successful damage dealt knocks you down. And the idea is that there's no consequences. No consequences for being knocked unconscious. So one of the ways that I want to deal that is that's when I start doing things like rolling on a critical hits table for like a lasting injury. Things that you can't, that don't represent just straightforward hit point damage. This is like, oh, well, you got knocked unconscious, you roll the first time you go unconscious, it's unlikely that you're going to have a lot of lingering injuries. We'll say lingering rather than lasting. Lingering, like non-HP damage injuries. So usually it's like the first one's usually for kind of free, because I assume I don't want to punish somebody just for going down. The punishment of not basically playing in the combat is already punishment enough for being reduced to 0 hit points and being KO'd. And I mean, we're already talking about it. I might as well talk about the death too. I just keep making this video longer and longer and longer. I got a lot of thoughts. I'm sorry. It's just trying to get them out. So lingering on HP damage. So this is going to be things like you're bruised the first time and bruised. So no lingering on sort of your first KO. Now once you start getting, if you pop up and then get knocked down again, now you got lingering injuries. So if you we'll just say successive pop up and down KOs deal more serious lingering injuries. So the idea being that if you get knocked down and somebody decides to bring you up with a healing magic, but they're only doing the minimum healing magic, basically ensuring that the next time that you get hit, you're probably going to get KO'd again. Things are going to start getting bad for you real fast if you decide to stay in the fight and not try to move to a place where you're not going to take damage immediately. So it goes from the first time, there's no sort of lingering effect when you get KO'd because there's already enough issues with being KO'd in a fight, which is you basically don't get to play the game, which is not great. Usually when that happens at my table, especially if a character has died, using the sort of 5th edition 2024 rules frame, at some point I usually try to either give them if they have any sort of side characters or retainers, I'll give them that character sheet or stat block to play while they're dead. Or I'll just give them the monsters to play. I'll give them a monster type to play and be like, hey, go kill your friends for the rest of this combat. And that's what you'll do. And you get to roll for the goblins and you get to decide how they disassemble the rest of your party. Why not? Let them have some fun too. And if they go easy on their friends, they decide to go easy on their friends. It's up to them. But, I don't feel like if they're not healing you, you're likely to go easy on them most of the time. You're like, nah, I'm going to kill my friends. Kill them all. Let's TPK them. Let's get that total party kill. So each one does more lingering damages, and so you start rolling on something that's like a critical hit table that will be familiar to anybody who's done any sort of like Warhammer fantasy or anything like that, where it's like there's a more likelihood that like maybe your hand's broken, you get an arm that's broken, you get a severed muscle or something like that, something that represents you're going to have a lingering, lasting injury from this that will take a lot. And there's nothing that HP healing magic is going to do that's going to reduce that lingering injury. They're going to have to do something like a lesser restoration or a greater restoration, or just ride it out with time and rest. And then it starts giving you non like damage related detriments. And non-damage detriments. So this is things like, I'll just do it here. Like hand use. So like if you have a broken or crushed hand or something like that, maybe you have fingers that get cut off, something like that. And now you're like, well, you can't really hold a sword or shield or anything in this hand, so you kind of lost the use of this one arm until you guys can find some sort of like greater, bigger magic, whether that's a greater or lesser restoration, a restoration spell, or need to take them to a more powerful magic caster in the world, which now becomes its own quest that you can go on to sort of figure out, try to regrow those fingers, or maybe you can do a full Luke Skywalker, and you're just like, no man, just cut it off at the wrist, and we'll just put an artificer hand on it. We'll give you a replacement limb. Especially with something like 5e in 2024 that already has prosthetics in the game. They're already built into it, where you can just do that for eyes and hands and feet and things like that. It's already built in, so use those mechanics. Because right now there's not really a reason to use those mechanics unless you just specifically want the flavor of, I have a character who lost their leg and they have a peg leg or whatever. Or a Warforged leg they've sort of grafted onto their body, something like that. But also have some sort of detriment, a reason for doing that. They might have a limp, so they're slowed basically. They're kind of permanently slowed until they get their limp back, and those are like low level ones. You get to things where it's like, well, they've gotten like part of their skull crushed, they've got a real bad concussion, and so maybe they have disadvantage on all their mental checks for now, or maybe they temporarily lose proficiency for all their sort of mental kind of skills and knowledge. So you're like, usually our wizard's really good at these history and arcana checks, but they just got their bell rung in the last combat, and now they're super loopy. We're just trying to keep them awake, but they're not super cogent and coherent as far as like, hey, can you help us solve this magic trap? And they're like, and they're just kind of out of it. And being able to sort of represent that in play in a way that's still fun, because the idea with the system is this is more of a sort of like penalty for that pop up, pop down kind of play style, and then you run into sort of situations like you have in 5e in 2024, where people don't really take death seriously in the game, because it becomes really difficult to hurt them. There's really no detriment for being knocked to 0 hit points, other than you're going to not have your next turn if somebody doesn't bring you up. So instead, adding some more detriment into it, being like, hey, if you're a healer and you have somebody unconscious, you need to be casting probably as large of healing spell as you can on them to ensure that they have enough hit points to not go down to 0 again, where they're going to have these sort of lingering injuries that you're trying to prevent. And that's one of your primary goals, as being the healer of the party, is to try to keep everybody healthy and hale so they can do their job. So that's the thing you're focusing on, or trying to grab them and literally pull them out of combat before you heal them, so they won't immediately get swiped by the monster as soon as they stand up, or as soon as they're brought back to consciousness. So it kind of gives you a little bit more tactical play to kind of play with for the combat side. And now gives you sort of things where... And I would also include maybe doing lingering damages for the sort of things that D&D doesn't do a good job of representing with hit point damage, like fall damage sometimes. Where you're like, oh, well, fall damage only goes up to, what, 24d6 or something like that. Well, the character HP pools are going to outstrip that damage threshold in a lot of high level cases. So you're telling me it doesn't matter from whatever height that I fall, that I will not take enough damage to be killed. And I understand that that's an edge case, and that's very much a rules as written as versus a rules as intended sort of thing, where they're just trying to make an example mechanical thing rather than saying, hey, a person can fall, if they have enough hit points, can fall from the heavens and still hit the ground, dust themselves off, and keep going on. And take a 1 hour short rest and feel completely fine afterwards. Yeah, I understand that that's not the intent, but we do want to try to avoid some of that stuff, and it's not necessarily a realism we're trying to capture with this. It's just trying to be like, if this is a style of play that is kind of problematic for the overall fantasy of the game, as well as DMs who are put in a situation where they look like they're being really nasty or anti-player if they're like, well, I'm going to hit the guy who's down on the ground unconscious and make him automatically fail 2 death saving throws. So we usually, as DMs, don't attack people who are already unconscious. But at the same time, you are not... From the player side, they're not going out of their way to ensure that person stays conscious after they've fallen unconscious the first time. And that's the sort of disconnect, and that's sort of the weird thing where the fantasy kind of breaks apart and unravels a bit, and we're trying to push that kind of back together, and we can kind of use the mechanics to kind of get there. And speaking of which, I did say that I was going to talk about death. Primarily in combat, but it happens in exploration too. But we're going to say death and dying. And this is another thing that kind of addresses the pop-up, pop-down from my angle, is that in Death and Dying, and I started running my D&Ds kind of like this a while ago. It kind of depends on the group. Some groups are kind of into it, some groups are not really into it. They really want to play sort of by the rules and the mechanics as they are. But for me, and so when I imagine this, is that there's no death saves. There's basically no detriment to being, and I call it basically TKO'd. So it's a technical knockout, not necessarily a full, you are unconscious, but you have been reduced in a way in which you are no longer able to continue the fight. So that might be, you have the full wind knocked out of you, you have a real nasty cut, and you're like holding your guts inside of yourself, or whatever it is, you have taken enough damage, you've taken enough abuse during the fight that you are no longer an effective combatant. So that's it. There's no death saving throws. The only way that you're going to die is if the party abandons you. We'll say, don't want to say abandoned, let's say leaves you to your fate. Let's do it that way. So, and I've talked about this a little bit before on the channel and in some other videos. But what this kind of boils down to is that you don't have to worry about the death saves or anything like that. This is the thing where me as the DM is like, oh, you're knocked unconscious. Here, you play these goblins unless somebody decides to get you back up, you're going to be out for the rest of the combat. You don't have to worry about it. There's no chance that there's a D20 roll that you're going to pop up and be fine. Just weirdly, naturally, that you're going to somehow wake up after a serious injury and get back into the fight as though nothing happened because you got 1 hit point back from popping up. But at the same time, you're not going to roll a 1 and lose 2 death saving throws, and just because somebody couldn't get to you in their turn, you're not going to die because somebody couldn't physically get to you to stop that. So the only way for you to die, I'm going to say that, for a PC to die, is if the party leaves you to your fate. So what does that mean? That means that they run from the encounter without collecting you. So they abandon you. So either they decide to abandon you because maybe it's just a really, really bad combat, and if you're playing in a world in which the world does not necessarily scale with the players, meaning there are both really, really easy encounters and really, really difficult encounters, they really have no place to trying to fighting these creatures. Then the only way that you are going to die is if they have to run from an encounter and nobody's stopping to pick up your body and basically firemen carry you out of there. So it gives you this another sort of little tactical layer, and mean like all you have to do is just making sure that you live long enough to pick your friend up off the floor and carry him with you. That's it. So that's one way. The other way is if you the monsters take you away, which is basically just the inverse of abandoning you. Either your friends leave you to the monsters, or the monsters take you away from them. And this represents things that are like very food motivated monsters. When you have your carrion crawlers, your ghouls, things like that, as soon as they knock somebody out, they jump on them and start dragging them out of the combat. If they can get you out of like what we consider the arena of combat, they are going to consume that character, and that character will be dead. You have left them to their fate by not stopping them. And so now that can shift goals in the middle of combat, which is one of the things that I want. So the goal in combat now shifts from, oh no, we're trying to kill all these ghouls, to like, oh, make sure those ghouls don't carry the rogue off by themselves, because they're definitely going to eat them, and the rogue will be full dead, and we won't have them, and we won't be able to sort of resurrect them, and depending on what our sort of revivification magic is at that point. Like Delicious in Dungeons. Yeah, it is kind of like that. Yeah. Where the monsters just don't go after... I mean, they're dead in Delicious in Dungeons is the thing. They're just full out dead. when they put them there for like the body collectors next to the path. But you are correct. Like, monsters don't seem to mess with them after that, which is an interesting thing. I'm hoping we're going to learn more about that in the next season, as to the dungeon works in very weird ways in that show, and I'm very excited to learn more. But yeah, that's sort of it for my idea, because I don't want... It really sucks. I have been that person who's sitting there, who gets knocked down in a combat, and I have to wait for 3 rounds while my friends don't come over and heal me and then just die. And I'm like, that's not fun. It's not fun that my character's just dead because, my friends, unfortunately, were too focused on killing the monsters than healing me. And I just I had bad luck, and I just rolled death saves and failed. That's not a super fun play experience. I'd rather it be like, hey, you don't have to worry about it. You're fighting a bunch of armored knights or something like that. Like, they're not going to spend the time. If you look like you're on the ground dying, they're going to assume you're on the ground dying. And they're not going to stop to, like, stab you to make sure you're dead. Unless they're doing it for dramatic effect for the story. In which case you would be like, well, you have the opportunity to stop them, or get your friend out of their clutches, or jump in front of the sword, or however we want to describe that narratively for you trying to keep your friends alive. But it does suck to basically be knocked out of the combat, so in a place where you can't really engage with the game, and also you lose your character at the end of that, or even before that combat's over, just because your friends were preoccupied. It's not a fun feeling, I can say, from both sides of the screen, watching it happen and being like, hey, you can always go, like, heal that person. Like, No, I don't want to waste my turn stabilizing them. I'd rather attack the monster again. Okay. And do that. So that's not fun. So that's sort of my ideas about death and dying that I want to try out. I've used it, like I said, I've used it in some games. And some parties really like this, some don't. Some are kind of sticklers for the existing rules. It kind of depends on the party. The people who have tried it haven't had really anything negative to say about it. And by that I mean, like, I haven't really gotten any concrete feedback. Now, obviously a very small sample size, but I would, if you're interested in it, I'd say, maybe try it out and give me some feedback as to whether that's worked in your games or not. If you want to try this out with removing death saving throws from your 5e or 2024 game and trying this sort of thing instead, and then trying to, when you have monsters that are sort of food motivated, trying to shift up combat a little bit, being like, hey, by the way, if this ghoul drags your friend off into the darkness of the tunnels of this dungeon while you guys are still fighting the rest of them, yeah, you're never going to see that character again, except for maybe as a ghoul later on in the campaign. But they're not coming back. they're going to be dead. Unless you can track down that ghoul and you split open their innards and pull your friend out of the remains of your friend, half-digested remains of your friend out of it, and see if you can do some revivification magic on that to bring them back. But it's a whole separate area. That's more about the magic system than death and dying. Yeah, so the last thing, and this is going to be the last thing that we're going to talk about now, because we've gone for the better part of 3 hours. And I guess this goes back up at the top. And these resource die mechanics should go up the top too, because this is really more of a core thing. I guess you could say it's an exploration thing, but it's kind of... I wanted to hit basically all the resource die mechanic to be something that is a little bit more utilitarian in the system. I want it to be something that impacts maybe all 3 pillars of play. Not sure what that's going to look at. Like, maybe that's something that deals with how class abilities work or how ancestry abilities work, and maybe they can be married to that ability thing, sort of like how recharge powers work. Maybe we could do something like that. That would be fun. But I'm got this up here, and the last thing that we are going to talk about today is which is something, I think I said it. This is something that is from XP Failure Base. This is another thing that comes specifically from the age system that I really, really like about it. And it also works in sort of like the Kids on Bikes style games too. For those of you who aren't familiar, I'm going to talk about the latter first, then I'll talk about the former. Anybody who hasn't played the sort of Kids on Bikes, Kids on Brooms, Never Stop Blowing Up, blah, 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 that sort of area of game design with the exploding dice and the increasing ability and skill scores and all that stuff. One of the things that they do that I really like is that every time that you fail a roll, you get, instead of having something that's like an inspiration, which is like 5e and 2024 does to sort of reward you for clever play or doing something different or anything like that, you get these basically failure tokens. So every time that you fail something, you get a token. When you fail whatever roll you're trying to do, whatever you're trying to achieve, you get a token, and that token basically, for those systems, works as a +1 to your next roll, which means that if, with their blowing up dice, if you roll a 4 on your d6 and you have 2 of these sort of tokens, you can spend 2 of those tokens to treat the die roll as if it was a 6, which allows you to blow that die up, which allows you to get more energy. So basically, you use your failures from before, the experience of having those failures, to power what you're doing now. And so failure-based XP leveling kind of works like that. So one of the things that the Kids on Bikes system and those systems do is that whatever motes you don't spend during the play that you have at the end of the session, because it's a skill-based game, so it has skill-based game sort of XP, which means that you have a small number of XP points that you use to buy individual skills rather than leveling up a class of a character. So it's a much more granular power scaling. But within that is essentially the motes or tokens that you have left over at the end of the session. That's your pool of XP to spend to increase things. So if you fail a whole bunch, there's a lot more opportunity, and you don't spend a lot of the tokens during play. You then have a nice little pile of things you can do to upgrade your characters. Like, well, I kind of sucked at that session, so here's some experience. So I banked a bunch of experience points, and now I spend that experience points. Which for me makes a little bit more sense, is that the unfortunate thing is how we kind of work with humans is that we learn a lot more from failure than we do from our successes. Because our failures tell us what didn't work, whereas our successes just tell us something that did work, which we already knew worked. That's why we did it, because it has a high rate of success. But the failure base tells us that. In the age system, it's very similar. It's very similar. It's basically you basically gain, let's say, I guess you gain XP by failing at rolls. Those failures become the, whatever you want to say, resource that is spent to upgrade or power up your PCs, which is really fun. So you gain those XPs by failing at rolls, and then those failures become the resource that is spent to upgrade or power up your PC, which is a very interesting way to do it. And it really falls in line with the the more you fail, the more you learn, rather than and the way that the age system really sort of encapsulates it is that, hey, if you walked through this adventure and nothing really challenged you, and you guys didn't fail a lot of rolls, you didn't really learn anything. You knew what to do, you went and did the thing. You didn't really gain a lot of fundamental life adventuring experience from this encounter. So the truth is that it creates a new dynamic where success equals loot, and failure equals experience. That's a cool system. I really like that system. It's like, yeah, sure, you went through this, adventure, and you guys just sailed through it. You barely failed any rolls. So you don't get a lot of experience from it, but you are going to get all that loot from it. So you succeeded, so you didn't have to spend any of your resources, so that means any extra money you've picked up, any extra healing items, magic items, all that stuff, that's all fat, man. That's all cheddar. That's all things you get to keep because you were good at doing what you did. Whereas if you got your butts kicked all the way through it, you spent a whole bunch of healing potions, your casters had to use a bunch of material components for spells and that stuff, where you're kind of eking that out, or it took a lot longer than you thought it was going to take. So now there's more adventuring gear, there's more resting, there's more fighting you had to do, which means there's more gear maintenance, all this other stuff that the very sort of daily operation of being an adventuring party, you spend a lot more resources to do that when you fail. And so the upside of that is that instead you gain experience. So you might not get as much loot. Maybe the bad guy gets away, and maybe that leads you on to the next step in your adventuring path for your campaign. But you guys learned a lot from the encounters by getting your butts kicked up and down the adventure. So maybe you have enough points to level up. So now the next time that you try to deal with this BBEG who got away this adventure, well, now you guys are more powerful. You've learned from your previous encounter with them, and now you know sort of their tactics, you know more about them, and that's represented mechanically as the power of your character being like, I have learned more about being an adventurer on this adventure by all the things that we collectively failed at. Which is a very cool system, and I really like that sort of failure-based XP leveling. And removes things like this sort of weird fundamental thing that happens in D&D, specifically contemporary D&D, but has always kind of been present. Whenever that sort of primary switch was made between loot was the thing that gave you experience in sort of like very, very old school, like getting the loot back to your home base safely was the primary means of like 1 GP to 1 XP kind of funnel. And then experience and loot became divorced, and they're not tied to each other. And then the primary way to get experience points was by killing monsters, which leads to a very combat heavy game, and that's why, you know, the game is now 2/3 to 3/4 combat focused, and most of the things that have any XP like written about it in the game are primarily monsters. All the monsters have an XP total compared to them, and also things like traps. Traps usually have an XP total for them as well. And you're like, so that's telling you, that's D&D informing you through its design where we think you should be spending your time in play. These are the things you should be doing. You should be defeating monsters or dealing with monsters, and defeating monsters in however you go, whether you decide that's to fight them or talk to them or trick them or sneak around them. That's there, but you only get the experience if you succeed. You don't get anything if you fail. But if you succeed, you get the experience points and any potential loot they have. Whereas failure in the system, nothing nice happens to you. Whereas this system is a lot more focused, like, oh, you failed a whole bunch, and that sucks. It sucks when you have a day at the table and your dice are just cold, and you can't seem to roll anything in the double digits. So you're rolling 1 through 9s all day in a 3 to 6 hour session of D&D, and you feel bad about it, but then at the end of the session you're like, oh, but I got a bunch of XP this session. And that's sort of the thing, is like, oh, well, now I'm a more potent adventurer because I've learned a whole bunch today. Because I failed at a whole bunch of stuff. Now I know that the things that I thought I knew, maybe I don't know as well, but I also learned some new things. And that's growth. That is character growth. Mechanically, at least. And maybe narratively, maybe that tells you stuff about your character, and you use the mechanics and the XP and the leveling up as a jumping off point for your personal character narrative and for the group's narrative, and be like, hey, you talk a little bit about, I wasn't really good at like picking locks or recognizing traps or whatever it was in this adventure or in this session. So one of the bonuses I've picked up with my level up is something like, I don't know, trap expertise or danger sense or all sorts of things. Expertise with my thieves' tools, etc. And that's sort of reflected in 5e vocabulary, reflected as to how I learned from that experience, which is a very cool thing to sort of put those things together. But that's going to be it for this one. Like I said, that's going to be it for this video. I'm going to stop it there. We are closing in on the 3-hour mark, and I still have another page and a bit to kind of go through about things that I wanted to talk about. Some of these things we talked about a little bit, but I want to talk about more. So maybe that's what we'll do next time. But that's going to be it for me today. If you guys enjoyed this, make sure to give it a like. If you want to support the channel, subscribe, share everything online. Sharing works a lot better than trying to rely on the YouTube algorithm, which is machines in charge of machines. So not a lot of human interaction there. So those are very helpful for the channel. So feel free to share it on Reddit or your preferred social media platform or your preferred TTRPG forum, whether that's D&D Beyond, Ian World, blah 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 blah, etc. You know what places you go online. You know where your communities are. So if you like this content, share it out for them. That's it for this session. I think next time we're going to jump back into the solo RPG. So if you wanted to see things like the resource die mechanic in play, that's the easiest way to see it, is in the solo RPG streams. We're going to hit that back next time. I believe, I'm trying to remember where we left off. We just rested with Rhymefire after the tiger attacks, and we were about to head back in to check out that chaotic miasma that's been infecting people, and try to see if we can continue our investigation, trying to find the source of it without getting sick ourselves, getting afflicted. So that's what we're going to do, and then who knows what we'll do. We'll we'll also check out more of this. So I also have some other things in the queue that we want to talk about. So that's it for me. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys, and I'll see you guys next time. All right, bye bye.